Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Let's begin with Story 1. The Pneumatic Railway Beneath London. London, 1863, the age of steam and smog. You're standing in mid-19th century London, a city roaring with the clang of iron hooves and choking on the black breath of steam engines. By this point, the metropolis had become the most populous city in the world and one of the dirtiest. Streets were crowded, congested, and coated in a stubborn layer of soot. Transportation had become both a marvel and a menace. The city's surface was bursting at the seams, and Londoners had begun to look below. While the London Underground officially began operations in 1863 with steam-powered trains, the story of the pneumatic railway is a curious, often overlooked side chapter. A story buried not just underground, but beneath the pages of history books. An idea blown into existence. The pneumatic railway emerged from a simple yet ambitious idea: use air pressure to move carriages through underground tunnels. It wasn't steam. It wasn't horse-drawn. It was silent, or at least quieter and cleaner. The man behind the concept was Thomas Webster Ramel, an engineer with a knack for speculative transport. He was fascinated with the idea of atmospheric railways technology that dated back to earlier experiments in Ireland and Devon. These prior attempts had failed due to rubber flaps freezing or rats nibbling at the vacuum seals. But Ramel was undeterred. With funding and the backing of the Crystal Palace Company, a short experimental railway was constructed in 1864, the Crystal Palace Pneumatic Railway. Riding on air. The railway ran for just a few hundred yards in Sydenham, under the grounds near the Crystal Palace. But despite its short length, the line was fully operational, with a station, ticket booth, and even real passengers. It worked by means of a large fan that blew air into a sealed tunnel, propelling a single carriage down the track. To return, the fan was reversed, sucking the carriage back like a child slurping a noodle. It was simple physics, made Victorian. The fan itself was no small affair. Built by the engineering firm of J.G. Mott & Co., it was reportedly 22 feet in diameter and powered by a steam engine. The passengers would sit in a specially constructed carriage, completely enclosed to preserve the air pressure, with thick doors and rubber seals. Once sealed, the carriage was quite literally blown forward. The experience. Imagine boarding a train with no engine in sight, no horse to pull, no tracks shuddering under the weight of a locomotive. Just a low hum, the whoosh of air, and a gentle forward motion like being in the lung of a mechanical giant. Passengers described the ride as smooth, curious, and rather like being carried in a breeze. For some, it felt more magical than mechanical. It was novel, it was peculiar, and it worked. For several months, it transported visitors through the small underground tube, sparking imagination about a future where entire cities might be threaded with pneumatic lines. Children reportedly begged their parents for repeat rides. Journalists gave it glowing descriptions. And yet it faded into obscurity. The underground context. To understand why the pneumatic railway never caught on fully, you have to understand the stubbornness of Victorian infrastructure and politics. While Ramel's experiment proved a functional prototype, it came at a time when London's transit authorities had already invested heavily in steam locomotion. The Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground railway, was already laying down tracks for traditional steam trains. The political will to upend that investment for an experimental system wasn't there. Additionally, technical issues remained. Keeping a vacuum seal over long distances proved difficult. Dirt, debris, and even rats could compromise the system. The massive fans required constant maintenance, and the ride, while smooth, couldn't reach the speeds of a traditional train. But these limitations didn't fully extinguish the dream. Ramel and other inventors continued proposing larger and more ambitious pneumatic systems, including one that would span multiple miles beneath the city. A second version of the pneumatic system was even proposed for mail delivery, an idea that did eventually materialize in a different form. The London Pneumatic Dispatch Company, which we'll explore in another story. But as for the Crystal Palace Railway, it remained a short-lived marvel, eventually dismantled and paved over, its tunnel forgotten for nearly a century, until construction crews rediscovered remnants in the 20th century. An experiment too soon. So why did this working invention never blossom into a full-scale system? Was it political short-sightedness, technological barriers, or simply the heavy inertia of existing investments in steam? Or was the world just not quite ready to be blown about underground? The mind behind the machine, Thomas Webster Ramel. You've heard his name, Thomas Webster Ramel, but who was this man who dreamed of moving people through tubes? Born in 1834, Ramel was an engineer and public health reformer. He had a keen interest in sanitation and transportation, two issues that defined London in the 19th century. The city's congestion was more than an inconvenience. It was a public health crisis. Ramel's early work with the General Board of Health revealed to him the consequences of overcrowding, poor air quality, and inefficient transport. So it wasn't a leap for him to imagine a world where movement of people and letters alike could happen beneath the city, out of sight and out of harm's way. Not in dirty coal-powered carriages, but in quiet, efficient tubes moved by nothing but air. That vision formed the heart of his proposals to Parliament and his collaboration with the Crystal Palace Company. He wanted to reduce friction, literal and social. But it wasn't just Ramel. He was building on earlier ideas, particularly those of Samuel Clegg and Joseph Samuda, pioneers of the atmospheric railway concept in the 1840s. Atmospheric railways, a broader movement. Atmospheric railways weren't a purely British affair. In fact, similar systems were tested in Dublin, Ireland. The Dalkey Atmospheric Railway, 1844–1854, used vacuum propulsion to move trains along a 1.5-mile line. It was operational and considered reliable until rats destroyed the leather vacuum seals. Paris, France, experiments in the 1860s proposed vast networks of pneumatic tubes for freight transport, some of which evolved into early versions of parcel delivery systems. New York City, Alfred Ely Beach famously built a secret pneumatic transit tunnel under Broadway in 1870, launching the Beach Pneumatic Transit. It functioned briefly as a demonstration, but never gained traction due to political opposition. So London's Crystal Palace line was part of a broader transatlantic curiosity, the idea that air ubiquitous, invisible, and clean might power the future. Still, of all the experiments, the Crystal Palace Railway stood out because it was open to the public. It charged fares, it carried passengers, and it operated not in theory but in practice. Yet the experiment didn't last. What happened next? After its launch in 1864, the Crystal Palace Pneumatic Railway operated for just a few months. Exact records are scarce, but contemporary accounts suggest it was a seasonal attraction, not a fully scheduled service. Part of the issue was its limited scope. The line was less than 600 feet long, barely enough to prove its viability on a larger scale. Visitors paid a small fee, took the ride, and left with wonder. But it was hard to convince government officials and industrial investors that this novelty ride could scale to the size of a true metropolitan transit system. There were also engineering limitations. The carriage relied on tight seals, and the fan had to generate a consistent air pressure. The slightest leak, dirt, or deformation in the tunnel disrupted efficiency. Victorian materials simply weren't up to the task of maintaining consistent air flow over long distances. Furthermore, the enormous fan engine required constant supervision. The promise of a low-maintenance, silent transit system clashed with the reality of its mechanical upkeep. By early 1865, the line had been quietly closed, dismantled, and largely forgotten, resurfacing in postal service. Though the Crystal Palace experiment ended, the concept of pneumatic delivery didn't die. Rammel's ideas found a second life in the form of pneumatic mail delivery. In 1863, around the same time as the Crystal Palace line, a separate system began operating in London to carry telegrams and letters across the city via pressurized tubes. The London Pneumatic Dispatch Company connected Euston Station with the General Post Office in Holborn. It moved small capsules containing mail through iron tubes underground, using air pressure to shoot them along the path at up to 30 mph. The capsules made a soft thudding sound as they hit rubber bumpers at the end of the line. The service expanded for a time, growing to over 6 miles of tubing by the late 19th century. In fact, pneumatic tube systems became a mainstay in banks, hospitals, and government buildings throughout the world. While the idea of transporting people by air pressure struggled to take off, transporting small items became a strange success. What Rammel couldn't accomplish with passengers, he helped inspire in packages. A rediscovery and a legacy reconsidered. For nearly a century, the Crystal Palace pneumatic railway lay forgotten. Then, in the 1930s, construction workers digging near the former Crystal Palace grounds unearthed part of the original tunnel. It was still lined with bricks, its dimensions just wide enough to imagine a small carriage whooshing through it. The discovery caused a brief stir in the paper's curiosity about what was described as a forgotten railway of air. Local historians began piecing together the story, using eyewitness accounts and Rammel's surviving engineering documents. This rediscovery prompted a minor reevaluation of Rammel's contribution to British engineering. No longer just a footnote in Victorian eccentricity, he was now seen as a thinker ahead of his time, one who recognized the limits of steam and dreamed of a different propulsion altogether. The fan he built, the tunnels he dug, and the seals he perfected were all part of a lineage that led, in strange ways, to modern vacuum trains like the Hyperloop concept, pneumatic mail and hospital transport systems, even air-powered amusement rides in theme parks. The idea of using atmospheric pressure to move objects once dismissed as impractical had quietly become embedded in everyday infrastructure. Was Rammel a failure? In the traditional sense, perhaps. He never oversaw a full passenger transit network. His designs were replaced by faster, louder, steam-powered locomotives. He died in 1879, not widely recognized, and certainly not celebrated. But success is sometimes more subtle. Ideas often outlive their inventors, and while Rammel's passenger railway was short-lived, his pursuit of clean, quiet, underground transport anticipated problems we still face today: pollution, overcrowding, and the need for sustainable movement through urban space. He may not have changed the course of transit in his lifetime, but he shifted the way people imagined it. What if we had continued developing air-powered public transport? Would our cities today sound different, smell different, feel different? A world that might have been. As the 20th century dawned, the Victorian era gave way to new technologies: diesel engines, electricity, reinforced concrete, and the pneumatic railway slipped quietly out of public memory. And yet, the silence that settled over Rammel's tunnel wasn't the end of the story. It was more like the pause between breaths. For a concept born in the soot and congestion of Victorian London, the idea of air-powered transport has lingered in the collective engineering imagination. Every few decades, it seems to re-emerge refitted, rebranded, yet echoing that same simple, elegant principle: use air to move things cleanly, quickly, and underground. It is in many ways a ghost idea, a relic not of failure but of premature birth. But to truly understand how and why the idea faded, yet continues to haunt the periphery of modern infrastructure, we must first explore the broader forces that shaped transit development in the 19th and 20th centuries. The triumph of steam and steel. The 1860s were not kind to experimental transport. By the time Ramel's pneumatic railway was operational, London had already opened the Metropolitan Railway, the world's first underground urban passenger line powered by steam locomotives. Its success cemented steam as the dominant force in mass transit for decades. Though loud, dirty, and prone to smoke-choked tunnels, steam engines were familiar to operators, powerful enough to move large carriages, supported by an ever-expanding rail manufacturing ecosystem. To adopt Ramel's pneumatic system at scale would have required a redesign of stations and carriages, regular maintenance of vacuum tubes and seals, convincing the public that air was more reliable than fire and steam. And perhaps most damning of all, it would have required visionary patience, a commodity that was in short supply among investors looking for fast returns. This is where many experimental technologies failed in the Victorian era. They worked, but they didn't scale easily. They needed refinement, investment, and time that the rapidly industrializing world didn't have. As London's underground network grew, it did so along the tracks of tradition. By the early 20th century, it had evolved into an electric-powered system cleaner and quieter than steam, but still a far cry from Ramel's air-blown dream. Pneumatic tube systems thrive in smaller forms. While passenger transport by air failed to catch on, the pneumatic delivery of objects, mail, documents, even money exploded in popularity across Europe and North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Post offices in Berlin, London, and Paris used pneumatic tubes to move letters between sorting centers. Banks and department stores installed tube systems to carry money safely between tills and back offices. Hospitals adopted the system to transport medicine and paperwork across large campuses. These systems often used compressed air or vacuum to send capsules through a network of pipes. They were fast, efficient, and mechanically simple. One could argue that Ramel's vision did find its place in the modern world, just not at the scale he intended. Echoes in the present, Hyperloop and beyond. Now fast forward. It's the 2010s. Congestion is once again a global problem. Cities choke with cars. Subways are overburdened. Flights are expensive and slow. And suddenly, a familiar idea returns cloaked in digital gloss and venture capital. The Hyperloop. Originally proposed by Elon Musk in 2013, the Hyperloop aims to transport passengers in pressurized pods through low-pressure tubes at speeds exceeding 700 mph. It's sleek, futuristic, and technologically complex. But its DNA, it's unmistakably pneumatic. Pressurized or vacuum tubes? Check. Capsules gliding along a near-frictionless surface? Check. Sealed environments to optimize air resistance? Check. Prototypes have been tested. Corporations have been formed. And while no full-scale Hyperloop is operational as of 2025, the race continues. There's a certain irony here. The same idea that was too novel for 1860s investors is now being revived as the transport of tomorrow. Ramel's work, once seen as eccentric, is now cited in feasibility studies and transport retrospectives. His name has become a historical footnote once again, but this time, a hopeful one. Was Ramel right all along? Looking back, the Crystal Palace pneumatic railway can be seen in three ways. As a technological curiosity, a whimsical, brief detour in London's transit story. As a practical failure, a system too complex, fragile, or costly for its time. as a visionary prototype, a proof of concept whose true potential was postponed, not dismissed. You may wonder, how many other inventions throughout history were simply too early? How many ideas failed not due to flaws, but because the world wasn't ready? In a world focused on what works now, visionaries like Ramel often struggle. Their success is not immediate. Their rewards are not financial. Instead, their work is buried beneath decades, sometimes centuries, waiting to be unearthed, reconsidered, and reimagined. Final thoughts: the ghost in the tunnel. The tunnel beneath the Crystal Palace has long been sealed. Its fan lies rusted. The air that once whooshed through it has been replaced by silence and soil. But if you were to stand above that forgotten strip of ground on a quiet London morning and close your eyes, perhaps you could still hear it. The faint hum of a dream. The rush of an idea before its time. The whisper of air pulling us forward. Story 2. The electric corset: beauty, posture, and Victorian shock therapy. The corset: fashion or function? To understand the electric corset, you must first appreciate just how central the corset was to the Victorian identity, not just for women, but for the entire visual code of the 19th century. The corset was a foundational garment, worn by women of nearly every social class. It shaped not only the body but also perceptions of morality, femininity, and status. A well-laced corset signified discipline. A straight spine suggested virtue. A narrowed waist hinted at both beauty and restraint. But as Victorian ideals of womanhood met the relentless advance of industrial innovation, something curious occurred. Electricity entered the boudoir. The shock of modernity. Electricity in the Victorian age was a marvel, new, mysterious, and poorly understood. To the average person, it was practically magical. It lit up street lamps, powered telegraphs, and according to certain inventors could rejuvenate the human body, cure depression, and even stimulate beauty. This was the backdrop for a flurry of electrotherapeutic inventions. Electromagnetic belts, electrified hairbrushes, vibrating slippers, and yes, electric corsets. The corset was already seen as a medical device in many circles. Physicians claimed it could correct spinal curvature, relieve internal pressure, and assist in maintaining correct posture. So why not take the next logical step and electrify it? Enterprising manufacturers saw opportunity, and thus, by the 1880s and 1890s, the electric corset was born. What was an electric corset? Despite the name, most electric corsets contain no actual wiring or batteries, at least not in the modern sense. Instead, they were often infused with metallic filaments, such as zinc and copper, stitched into the fabric. The idea was based on galvanism, a theory that an electric current could be generated from the contact of dissimilar metals, like a primitive battery. When these corsets were worn against the skin, especially with moisture, from sweat, for instance, they could produce a mild galvanic response, a tingling or warming sensation that was interpreted as therapeutic. One famous advertisement from the 1890s promised: restores health and youthful energy, enriches the blood, strengthens the nerves, and refines the figure. Requires no batteries, the wearer's own motion produces the effect. In other words, just wear it, and let your body movement activate the corset's unseen powers. It was fashion, it was medicine, it was science, and it was a gimmick, but it worked, or at least people believed it did. Who wore it and why? Electric corsets were marketed to a very specific demographic: middle-class women concerned with both health and beauty. The 19th century saw a shift in how women were perceived and how they perceived themselves. As medical ideas about nervous disorders, including hysteria, melancholia, and neurasthenia, grew in popularity, women were often diagnosed as weak, fatigued, or chronically delicate. An electric corset promised to strengthen the very nerves that modern life seemed to fray. There was also a darker side. These corsets were marketed to women who were told they needed to look a certain way. Posture was not just about standing tall, it was about moral uprightness. A slumped woman was seen as lazy, untrustworthy, or even wanton. Electric corsets offered a way to enforce the silhouette of virtue and reinforce the idea that electricity could energize the soul, uplift the body, and regulate womanly conduct. Some corsets even included mild vibration elements, often created using coiled metal or spring tension, which could create a buzzing sensation as the wearer moved. The sensation was said to stimulate circulation and awaken the body's natural magnetism. The medicalization of clothing. This period in history was filled with medical marvels, many of them questionable. The line between a doctor's treatment and a salesman's promise was blurrier than today. Electric belts were prescribed for male impotence. Magnetized soles were said to cure rheumatism. Copper-lined undergarments could reportedly combat tuberculosis. And corsets, already controversial for their tight lacing, were now imbued with the glow of scientific authority. The medical community was divided. Some physicians supported the use of electrotherapy in general, though they were skeptical of mass-produced garments. Others warned that prolonged exposure to metal on the skin could cause rashes, or worse, interfere with natural bodily vapors. But in an era where arsenic wafers were sold for complexion improvement and cocaine drops for toothache, electric corsets seemed relatively tame. They became a staple of mail-order catalogs and boutique shops. Some were imported from Paris, others manufactured in New York. Prices varied, but the most expensive models were luxuriously stitched, with intricate boning and lace, hidden science disguised as seduction. Aesthetic science or quackery. Modern scholars tend to group the electric corset into a category known as quack medicine, but the story isn't so simple. For many women, the sensation of warmth and stimulation provided real relief, especially in an age when daily physical labor, domestic strain, and poor ergonomics took a toll on the body. And the psychological boost from wearing what was believed to be cutting-edge medical clothing likely had a genuine placebo effect. Some reported better sleep. Others said their anxiety diminished. Some simply stood taller and felt stronger. But did the electric corset truly enrich the blood, or refine the figure through molecular alignment, as advertisements claimed? Not likely. Still, its popularity speaks volumes, not about gullibility but about desperation. Women sought power in a society that denied them autonomy. If electricity could grant health, beauty, or even a small sense of control, why not embrace it? As the century drew to a close, the electric corset remained both a curiosity and a cultural symbol. It fused vanity with science, fashion with fear, and perhaps most of all, it illuminated a society increasingly willing to electrify the body in the name of better living. But what happened when science caught up with fashion? When real electricity became mainstream? Did the electric corset evolve or disappear? The turn of the century, a society in flux. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the world began to shift technologically, socially, and medically. Electricity, once a mysterious and exotic force, was becoming increasingly common in urban households. It illuminated street lamps, powered sewing machines, and began to enter the home in small, manageable doses. But with familiarity came scrutiny. What had once been considered an invisible miracle, electricity coursing through garments and belts, was now met with a more discerning eye. Doctors began to distinguish between real therapeutic devices and the ever-expanding catalog of so-called electromedical marvels. And among the first items to be called into question were wearable electrics like the electric corset. Yet even as skepticism grew, these devices remained wildly popular. The intersection of fashion, medicine, and marketing was proving to be a resilient one. Marketing the mystique of the invisible. Victorian advertising was a language all its own, and when it came to electric corsets, the message was consistent. Science equals health, health equals beauty, beauty equals success. Women were promised not only relief from female weakness, but also radiant energy, improved posture, and more favorable courtship prospects. Some product descriptions were overt in their claims. This marvelous garment channels nature's electric force through your spine and limbs, energizing the nerves and blood. Other ads veered into the spiritual. A garment attuned to the vibratory rhythm of the universe, correcting disorder from within. Often, these corsets were sold in general merchandise catalogs alongside items like magnetized brushes, healing crystals, and electromassage gloves. They were part of a growing industry of self-care products marketed to women who lacked access to formal medical treatment or distrusted it altogether. It's easy to scoff at such claims now, but context matters. Victorian women lived in a medical world largely dominated by men. Their symptoms were frequently dismissed as hysteria or nervous fatigue, and their access to treatment was often limited by social standing or geography. The idea of controlling one's own wellness, even through a questionable device, offered a kind of power that traditional medicine did not. Behind the scenes, how these corsets were made. Physically, electric corsets were constructed much like traditional ones, boned with steel or whalebone, tightly fitted, and often reinforced at the seams. What made them electric was the addition of galvanic elements, generally thin strips of zinc and copper, sewn or riveted into the fabric. These two metals, when placed in contact with the skin and exposed to perspiration, created a very small electrical current through a process similar to a wet cell battery. While the voltage was minuscule, it was enough to produce a tingling sensation on the skin, perceived as therapeutic stimulation. Some corsets went even further, including removable galvanic plates or adjustable tension coils that would flex and vibrate slightly with movement. These were primitive and entirely mechanical. No batteries were involved, but they added to the illusion of scientific sophistication. A handful of corsets did attempt more direct electrical intervention. Some later models were wired with low-voltage batteries akin to the electric belts of the same period. These often required the wearer to connect wires to a small power source worn at the waist or hidden in a pocket. These battery-powered corsets were less popular, primarily because they were expensive and uncomfortable. The risk of minor burns or electrical discharge was also real, particularly in humid climates or for women wearing multiple layers of undergarments. The intersection of morality and electricity. The electric corset lived in a fascinating space between modesty and modernity. On the one hand, it was a deeply conservative garment, reinforcing traditional ideas about posture, waist size, and feminine appearance. On the other, it embraced a radical modern technology, electrical current, as a means of control and enhancement. That contradiction wasn't lost on social critics. Some religious authorities warned against unnatural stimulation of the body. Others questioned whether these garments could have sexual implications, given their effect on sensitive areas of the body. A few newspapers even published sensationalist pieces warning that electric corsets could inflame the passions or induce agitation in the weaker sex. For most wearers, though, the experience was more mundane. Reports from diaries, letters, and periodicals describe sensations like a gentle heat near the kidneys, a buzzing at the spine when walking briskly, a feeling of tightness relieved by a subtle hum. These experiences, real or imagined, only reinforced the corset's reputation as a therapeutic tool. It didn't just shape the body, it stimulated it. And in a society where women were increasingly told they were overworked, undernourished, or biologically inferior, even the faintest buzz of invigoration could feel like revolution. The decline of the electric corset. By the early 1900s, fashion and medicine both began to move on. The Gibson girl silhouette gave way to looser dresses, and the tightly cinched waist became less dominant. In parallel, new medical standards and scientific journals began scrutinizing electrotherapeutic devices more rigorously. Articles published in the Lancet and British Medical Journal began classifying many such products as pseudoscientific or fraudulent. The U.S. Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 took direct aim at misleading health claims in advertising, including those made by corset manufacturers. As the corset itself fell out of fashion, replaced gradually by girdles, bust bodices, and eventually brassieres, there was little reason to continue producing its electrified counterpart. By the 1920s, the electric corset had all but vanished. It lingered only in novelty shops and the pages of mail-order catalogs printed on fatting paper. Yet, despite its disappearance from the wardrobes of women, its influence didn't entirely die. The idea that wearable devices could enhance health, improve appearance, or stimulate the body electrically would return. It would just look very different. A concept that never really died. Think about it. What is a TENS unit if not a refined, targeted electric corset? What are modern posture correctors if not high-tech successors to 19th century shape-enforcing garments? And what about the explosion of wearable tech, from smartwatches that track health metrics to electrical muscle stimulators for athletes? These are not new ideas. They are old obsessions with new packaging. The electric corset may seem like a Victorian absurdity, but it occupies a critical position in the long lineage of wearable wellness devices. It was the first time fashion tried to act like a physician. The first time the body was seen as a system to be optimized through technology worn on the skin. But what does it say about us that the same hopes for vitality, control, and self-improvement continue to live on in our gadgets over a century later? A new era, from girdles to gadgets. As the 20th century wore on, the electric corset receded into the margins of memory. It became a relic of the Victorian obsession with improvement, one among many examples of medical quackery and overpromised technology. And yet, its spirit lived on. In fact, to trace the story of wearable technology, especially in health and wellness, is to trace the descendants of the electric corset. Though stripped of its copper coils and galvanic claims, the idea of a garment that improves your body never went away. It merely changed shape, name, and science. From girdles in the 1930s to neoprene, sweat belts of the late 20th century, manufacturers continued to promise that what you wore could reshape not just how you looked, but how you functioned. And with the rise of electricity as a truly domestic force, new iterations of wearable wellness were born. These were not pseudoscientific fads, necessarily, but more refined cousins of their corseted ancestors. Electrostimulation belts designed to tone abdominal muscles. Posture-correcting vests that buzz when you slouch. Heated compression garments marketed to athletes. Smart bras that track breathing and heart rate. Even electronic shapewear that claims to stimulate metabolism. In essence, we are still wearing our technology just as Victorian women did. Medical fashion and the question of autonomy. The electric corset also leaves behind a legacy of bodily control, both imposed and voluntary. Corsets were always about control, shaping the body to meet the demands of fashion, posture, or medical orthodoxy. When electrified, they added a layer of mechanized self-regulation. The idea was simple: wear this garment and it will guide you electrically, subtly, invisibly toward a better version of yourself. This concept resonates still. From fitness trackers that vibrate when you're inactive, to rings that monitor your sleep and hydration, the surveillance of the self through clothing and wearables has become increasingly normalized. We don't even question it anymore. But in the 19th century, this was a radical notion. The idea that your clothing might stimulate your organs, or realign your spine, or correct your nervous energy was part of a larger cultural experiment. What happens when science becomes personal? When the machine becomes intimate? The electric corset was, in many ways, a cyborg prototype. Not in the metallic, sci-fi sense, but as an early attempt to fuse flesh with function. To allow a woman to carry technology on her person, not in her hands, but against her skin. That was a quiet revolution. Forgotten inventors, unspoken stories. It's worth noting that the creators of electric corsets were not always known or remembered. Many were anonymous workshop tailors or enterprising salesmen working under umbrella catalogs. Few patents exist under individual names. This reflects a broader pattern in the history of women's wellness technology. The users are remembered, often derided, but the designers fade into obscurity. The same anonymity cloaks many 19th century female inventors, those who worked behind the scenes on the margins of accepted science. And while we can find names like Dr. Scott's electric corset in old ads, it's unclear whether Dr. Scott was a real physician, a marketing creation, or both. Still, someone had to sew the wires into fabric. Someone had to test the feel of copper against skin. Someone, likely a woman, had to wear the prototype, feel the buzz, and say, yes, this might sell. These untold stories remind us that historical innovation is not always led by famous men in laboratories. Sometimes it's quiet, domestic, and stitched into the seams of underclothes. The dignity of small relief. One of the more human aspects of the electric corset is how earnestly it attempted to help. Not cure, not save, but relieve. Even if the device didn't stimulate nerves or adjust posture through current, it still offered something that many women lacked, a moment of feeling cared for. Whether that care was genuine or simply bought, whether the relief was placebo or perceptual, it mattered. For women laboring under social constraints, under physical strain, under the crushing expectations of idealized femininity, a garment that buzzed or warmed or lifted could mean something. Perhaps not in volts, but in value. In a world that often punished female pain, the electric corset offered the illusion that suffering could be treated, not just endured. That illusion, however scientifically hollow, had power. A thoughtful look at the absurd. From the safe distance of modern hindsight, it's easy to laugh at the electric corset. A tight-laced garment laced with copper, a dress that promised to align your molecular vibrations. It all seems absurd yet familiar. Our own age is filled with smart rings that monitor stress, jade rollers that stimulate lymphatic energy, and cold therapy wraps sold to athletes and influencers alike. We still crave transformation. We still believe the body can be hacked, improved, elevated not through discipline alone, but through something we can wear, something we can buy. In that sense, the electric corset isn't so much a relic as a prequel, a whisper from the past reminding us that we've always chased perfection with wires and straps and the shimmer of science. And just as then, the boundary between relief and reinvention remains thin. A spark in the timeline. The electric corset didn't change fashion. It didn't revolutionize medicine. But it sparked a conversation about control, about technology, about the body as a site of experimentation. And in doing so, it carved out a strange little footnote in the story of human ingenuity. It asked questions that still linger in our skin. What if you could wear your cure? What if beauty and health could be built into your seams? What if comfort could hum against your ribs like a promise? The corsets are gone, the wires removed, the galvanic plates rusted and lost. But that dream, the one where you change your life by changing your clothes, that dream never stopped buzzing. Story 3. The writing telegrapher when the pen met the wire. The age of instant communication. By the mid-19th century, the telegraph had radically transformed the speed at which people could communicate. What once took days or weeks by messenger or mail coach could now travel across continents in minutes. Messages leapt from town to town along copper lines, propelled by electric pulses and decoded by trained telegraphers tapping out Morse code. The telegraph was more than a convenience, it was a cultural shockwave. Governments relied on it. Businesses adapted to it. Even ordinary citizens began to trust the strange, stuttering rhythm of a new language made entirely of dots and dashes. And yet, despite its utility, the telegraph came with a barrier. It required translation. The sender needed to know Morse. The receiver needed to transcribe it. Every message passed through human intermediaries skilled, attentive, and sometimes error-prone. So what if the system could be simplified? What if, instead of laboriously learning a code, you could simply write a message by hand and have a machine transmit your very handwriting over the wire? That was the dream of the writing telegraph, a forgotten Victorian invention that blended the elegance of script with the pulse of electricity. And strangely enough, it worked. Writing at the speed of thought. The concept of the writing telegraph emerged in the 1850s and 1860s, when inventors across Europe and America began experimenting with ways to make the telegraph more intuitive. Instead of using Morse code, these devices aimed to replicate the sender's exact handwriting, transmitting the motion of the pen itself across the wire, to be reproduced on paper at the receiving end. It was, in effect, a proto-fax machine, though that term wouldn't appear for nearly a century. One of the earliest functioning models was created by David Edward Hughes, a British-American inventor. In 1855, he introduced a version of the printing telegraph that typed messages using a keyboard, but his later experiments dabbled in stylus-driven mechanisms that could trace letters. Then came the boldest innovation of all, the telewriting system, which used a pair of connected pens, one in the sender's hand, the other driven by electromagnets to mimic every stroke. The idea was beautifully simple in theory. Move your hand here, and the pen there copies it. But the machinery behind this simplicity was anything but simple. How the writing telegraph worked. Imagine you're sitting at a wooden desk in a London telegraph office in the 1870s. You lift a stylus attached to a metal armature. As you write the word hello, every movement, upward stroke, downward curl, gentle pause gets translated into variable electrical signals. These signals travel along telegraph wires to a remote station, where a second stylus connected to synchronized electromagnetic servos mirrors your hand's motion in real time. On a blank sheet of paper far away, your message appears, not in generic type, but in your own cursive handwriting. To achieve this, early writing telegraphs used multiple electrical circuits to track X and Y axis movements. Some systems also included a pressure-sensitive component to replicate line weight and dotting. The goal was fidelity, not just communication but reproduction. And to a surprising degree, it succeeded. The earliest working models produced shaky but legible handwriting. With refinement, later designs could replicate even signatures, a feat that would later have legal and financial implications. It was, in a very real way, the birth of remote handwriting. The appeal and the limitations. The writing telegraph promised to bring humanity back into a technology that had, until then, relied on abstraction. In Morse, a word was a code, a sentence was a rhythm, but with the writing telegraph you could see the person behind the message, their curves, slants, hurried loops, or careful capitals. You could recognize someone by their script. That emotional resonance made the invention particularly appealing to businessmen who wanted contracts transmitted with accurate signatures, banks which were starting to use telegraphs for fund transfers, government agencies which valued authenticated messages, and even loved ones, separated by distance, who found comfort in familiar script. But as with many Victorian innovations, the writing telegraph came with a long list of complications. For one, it was fragile. The mechanical arms had to be precisely aligned. The paper had to be fed evenly. The system required constant calibration. A single grain of soot or slip in the gears could distort entire messages. It was also expensive. Unlike Morse code, which could be transmitted with a single key and sounder, the writing telegraph demanded complex instruments on both ends, often custom-built. And most critically, it was slow. The stylus could only move as fast as a hand could write, and every hesitation, flourish, or embellishment added to the transmission time. A page of handwriting might take several minutes to fully replicate an eternity in the world of urgent telegrams. Still, the appeal of the idea never quite faded. Who invented what? While many inventors dabbled in telewriting, two names deserve special mention. Edouard Belin, a French engineer who, in the early 20th century, would refine the idea into a pantelegraph, capable of transmitting images over phone lines. His work laid the groundwork for modern fax machines. Elisha Gray, better known as one of the rivals to Alexander Graham Bell in the race to invent the telephone, Gray also experimented with harmonic telegraphs and remote writing mechanisms. His ideas were theoretical but influential. Some historians believe that these early telewriters influenced more than just communication. They sparked new ideas about remote control, machine mimicry, and the transmission of identity. After all, if you could transmit a person's writing, what else could you transmit? Movement, voice, thought. The writing telegraph planted these questions like seeds. Though the device itself never became widely adopted, its conceptual legacy would stretch far beyond the Victorian desk. The writing telegraph in daily life. In the few cities where prototypes were tested, including parts of London, Paris, and New York, users reported a sense of strange intimacy. Receiving a handwritten message over wire felt different from reading a typed telegram. It was more personal, more real. Some described it as ghostly, the hand of a friend appearing without the person. In one documented instance, a banker in Edinburgh received a signed authorization for a loan from a partner in Manchester via writing telegraph. The signature matched so perfectly that it was accepted as legally binding, possibly the first remote signature verification in history. Another user, a woman in Boston, described the moment she saw her sister's looping script appear before her in real time from Chicago. "It was as if she were writing across the room," she wrote in her diary. "I could almost hear her sigh between the lines." For all its flaws, the writing telegraph captured something that Morse could not: the voice of the hand. But could that voice survive the rise of faster, simpler technologies? Could intimacy compete with efficiency? Or would the dream of handwritten connection be lost in the march toward mechanization? A world in motion, the need for signature and trust. By the latter half of the 19th century, the world was beginning to shrink. Railways connected cities, telegraphs spanned oceans. Finance, politics, journalism, even romance moved at a pace previously unimaginable. But with that speed came a new problem: authentication. When messages no longer traveled by hand, how could anyone be sure who sent them? A telegram signed Edward Blake could have come from anyone with access to a telegraph office. There was no handwriting, no ink, no personal flourish, just code, tapped by an operator and transcribed by another. It was efficient but impersonal, and in some cases dangerously insecure. Enter the writing telegraph again, not just as a novel gadget, but as a solution to a modern problem: verifying identity. By replicating a person's actual handwriting over long distances, the writing telegraph provided a critical new function: remote signature transmission. Banks in particular took note. If an account holder in Liverpool could send a withdrawal authorization to London with their signature intact, one that looked like it had been written in ink by their own hand, it could revolutionize how money moved. It wasn't just about letters anymore. It was about legality, security, and trust. And for a brief period, the writing telegraph seemed poised to become a mainstay of high-trust communication. The technical triumphs and headaches. To make remote handwriting viable, inventors worked feverishly to refine the machines. Later models of writing telegraphs, sometimes called teletographs or teleautographs, relied on a series of coordinated mechanisms. Pantograph arms that tracked pen motion in 2 dimensions. Rheostats to convert those motions into varying electrical currents. Electromagnetic servos that recreated those motions on a receiving stylus. Some even included return mechanisms, allowing a kind of spring-back action, so the stylus could follow loops and flourishes with more realism. But the elegance of the design was constantly threatened by one stubborn factor: friction. Ink could blot, pens could drag, mechanical arms could seize up in damp weather or swell in the heat. Early systems were incredibly sensitive to environmental variables, requiring near-perfect conditions for accurate operation. And then there was the matter of latency. In faster telegraphy systems, latency was barely an issue. A message either arrived or it didn't. But with writing telegraphs, every millisecond of delay could warp a stroke. A signature with a delayed upstroke could appear skewed. A letter L might become an I. The effect, while subtle, eroded the reliability of the system for legal or financial use. Engineers tried to correct for this with buffering systems, but in an analog era, there were limits to what could be done. Still, when the machines worked, they were astonishing. Demos at world's fairs and trade expos drew crowds. People were amazed to watch a letter form in ink from a pen that no human hand was touching. A kind of telepresence before the term existed. The social impact of seeing someone's hand. The Victorian world was deeply invested in appearances, and handwriting was considered a window into the soul. Entire books were written on the interpretation of script. Graphology, the pseudoscientific study of handwriting, suggested that slant, pressure, and letter formation revealed traits like honesty, intelligence, or criminal intent. So when a message arrived not in Morse code, but in someone's actual handwriting, the social and psychological effect was powerful. Letters no longer read like transactions. They felt like presence. A hurried script meant urgency. A long pause between words, visible in the time gaps on the page, suggested hesitation. Even the shape of an exclamation mark could carry emotional weight. The writing telegraph was, in this sense, an early experiment in emotional bandwidth. At a time when most remote communication was flattened into code, the ability to convey tone, tempo, and personality through handwriting made the technology feel alive. And in a world increasingly mechanized, that humanity mattered. Competing inventions and a crowded future. Despite its promise, the writing telegraph was not the only technology evolving. By the 1880s and 1890s, telephone systems were expanding rapidly. Unlike the writing telegraph, the telephone delivered voice with all its nuance and spontaneity. It was cheaper to implement, easier to operate, and didn't require precise machines at either end. Then came typewriters. Once rare and clunky, by the turn of the century typewriters had become efficient, affordable, and increasingly common in offices and homes. They didn't transmit messages, but they made written communication faster, neater, and more legible qualities the writing telegraph still struggled with. Even worse for the writing telegraph, most users were content with telegram-style summaries. Business people wanted facts, not flourishes. Messages didn't need to be beautiful, just accurate. So while the writing telegraph had succeeded in transmitting script, It failed in delivering what the New World truly valued: speed and scale. As a result, its commercial viability weakened. By the early 20th century, writing telegraphs were relegated to specialty applications used in high-security communications, art experiments, and demonstration settings. The dream lingered, but the market moved on. A shift in values. The slow disappearance of the writing telegraph marks more than a technological failure. It reflects a shift in what society valued. Where once people prized expressiveness, personal style, and the aura of the handwritten, the New World craved efficiency, clarity, and standardization. Signatures gave way to initials. Letters gave way to bullet points. Even handwriting itself, once a measure of refinement, began to be seen as impractical in business contexts. It was not just the writing telegraph that fell into disuse, but the idea that how you said something mattered as much as what you said. And yet, the technology never truly vanished. In 1888, Elisha Gray patented his version of the writing telegraph, the teletograph. It was used for decades in niche applications: hotel front desks, military communications, and industrial design. As late as the 1940s, teletographs were in active use in hospitals and air traffic control centers, where clear, manual instructions could be written and transmitted in real time. The handwriting hadn't disappeared. It had simply been repurposed from an emotional connection to an operational tool. But even then, the question lingered. Had we lost something by letting it go? The last lines written by machine. By the early 20th century, the age of the writing telegraph was waning. While the teletograph, patented by Elisha Gray in 1888, carried the concept forward in some limited commercial settings, it was clear that the grand vision, a world where handwriting flowed through wires like water, had not materialized. And yet, the final chapter of the writing telegraph wasn't marked by total failure. In fact, its quiet persistence in certain corners of society reveals something unexpected: the deep need for human presence, even in mechanical communication. Hospitals, for instance, used teletographs well into the mid-20th century to transmit prescriptions and surgical orders across floors, critical messages that benefited from the immediacy and clarity of handwritten notes. In rail stations and factories, supervisors wrote instructions that were instantly mirrored in control rooms. These devices required no translation, no typing, just the fluent motion of a hand. In contexts where precision mattered more than speed, handwriting still held its ground. The last widely used writing telegraphs were phased out in the 1980s, replaced by fax machines, email, and eventually instant messaging. But for nearly a century, they endured as a small defiance against the tyranny of the typed word. From telegraph to tablet, the line continues. The influence of the writing telegraph didn't end with its physical components. Instead, its concept that a hand's motion could be captured, digitized, and transmitted became the foundation of modern input technology. Consider this: every time you draw on a digital tablet, sign on a credit card machine, or use a stylus on a touchscreen, you are participating in the dream of the writing telegraph. Today's tablets and styluses rely on capacitive touch, pressure sensitivity, and digital replication, but they trace their roots directly to the 19th century idea of transmitting pen motion across distance. In fact, in modern software, your handwriting can be translated into text, stored in databases, matched against signatures for security purposes, rendered on the screen of someone thousands of miles away in real time. We often think of digital tools as purely modern, yet they carry in their design the echoes of inventions long buried. The ghost of the writing telegraph is in your pocket, even if you never knew it. Why the hand still matters. Despite the digital tide, handwriting has refused to vanish. and the reasons might be deeper than nostalgia. Cognitive science has shown that writing by hand activates different parts of the brain than typing. It improves memory, comprehension, and emotional connection. The act of shaping a letter is tactile, rhythmic, embodied. In many cultures, a handwritten note still carries meaning far beyond its content. A job candidate's thank you letter, penned in ink, suggests sincerity. A handwritten recipe from a grandparent becomes a keepsake. A hastily scrawled love letter can feel more intimate than a polished email. The writing telegraph was built on that understanding long before the science caught up. It recognized that handwriting was not just data, it was presence. When a pen moves, it carries personality, mood, and intention. The inventors of the 19th century tried to bottle that movement, channel it through wire, and recreate it far away, not because it was efficient, but because it was human. The unanswered question: so why didn't it catch on? Why didn't we all grow up with writing telegraphs in our homes instead of fax machines or email? The answer lies in what the world demanded. In the end, speed, cost, and simplicity won. It was faster to type. It was cheaper to use Morse. It was simpler to print than to trace. The writing telegraph was always chasing an ideal that the market didn't prioritize: fidelity over function. But perhaps its real victory was ideological. It dared to suggest, in a century defined by industry and impersonality, that the hand still mattered, that a person's movement could be as worthy of transmission as their message. That insight lives on not in cables, but in code. Every stylus gesture, every Apple Pencil flourish, every digital signature authentication is a tribute to that forgotten lineage. The writing telegraph failed as a product, but it succeeded as an idea. The pen that wrote without a hand. Today, in an age where communication is instantaneous, and AI can mimic speech, faces, and even voices, the writing telegraph feels quaint, an old-fashioned attempt to make machines more human. But perhaps it also offers a quiet warning. In seeking speed, we sometimes surrender authenticity. In chasing clarity, we lose texture. And in automating presence, we may risk forgetting what presence feels like. There was a time when receiving a letter in someone's handwriting meant more than reading their words. It meant you had touched something they had touched, that they had paused, pressed, smudged, left themselves in the ink. The writing telegraph tried to preserve that magic across miles. It didn't last, but the desire behind it still does. Story 4. The Mustache Guard Cup, sipping tea without offense. A face full of fashion. To enter the Victorian era is to enter a world of strict etiquette, meticulous grooming, and a fixation with personal presentation. Men's fashion was as regulated as women, though less talked about, and nothing symbolized masculine decorum more prominently than facial hair, particularly the mustache. By the mid to late 19th century, mustaches were not merely popular, they were expected. A clean-shaven man was considered either a boy or a radical. Among military officers, aristocrats, and middle-class professionals, a finely groomed mustache projected authority, virility, and respectability. British Army regulations in the 1850s even required soldiers to wear mustaches. The expectation filtered into civilian life. From railway conductors to solicitors, the mustache was the must-have accessory, so much so that entire industries formed around it. But there was one small, nagging issue with this facial fashion: drinking hot beverages. The problem with tea. The Victorian gentleman drank a great deal of tea. Tea was more than refreshment, it was ritual. It was social, civil, and constant. And in upper and middle-class circles, it was consumed from fine porcelain cups, delicate, thin, and open-lipped. Now imagine pressing your exquisitely waxed mustache against such a cup. The steam softens the wax. The heat melts it. And as you tilt the cup to drink, your mustache dips into the liquid, collecting droplets of tea or milk. Worse still, those droplets might drip onto your shirt or stain your collar. Even a single mishap could undo hours of grooming or, worse, social embarrassment. In a society obsessed with polish and propriety, this simply wouldn't do. And so, in an act of quietly brilliant innovation, a small object was born. The mustache guard cup. A design of quiet genius. The mustache cup was not some elaborate machine. It was a simple modification to an everyday item, a porcelain teacup, crafted with a built-in ledge or guard just below the rim on one side. This ledge, sometimes called a mustache cradle, featured a semicircular opening just large enough for the drinker's lips to pass through. The mustache, meanwhile, would rest safely on the guard, protected from liquid, steam, and social disaster. It was an elegant solution to a highly specific problem. Invented in the 1860s, the mustache cup is generally credited to Harvey Adams, an English potter working during the peak of the facial hair craze. Adams recognized a need in the market. How could gentlemen enjoy tea, coffee, or cocoa without compromising their appearance? His invention quickly became a hit. Soon, mustache cups were produced in a wide variety of styles and materials. Fine bone china for the upper class, heavier ceramic or stoneware for daily use, silver-plated variants for formal occasions, and even glass cups, sometimes etched with the guard in clear relief. Not just a cup, a social statement. The mustache cup was more than functional. It was a statement of grooming, status, and personal refinement. Owning one said something specific. I take pride in my appearance, and I care enough to protect it even while drinking tea. These cups were often monogrammed, gifted, or passed down. Some featured political slogans, military insignia, or gentlemanly mottos like "for the dandy" or "trim and proper." In England and continental Europe, they became standard fare in gentlemen's clubs, railway refreshment rooms, and high-end hotels. It wasn't uncommon to enter a well-appointed drawing room and be offered your own mustache cup from a selection clean, polished, and awaiting service. Even in private homes, hosting a guest without offering an appropriate cup could be seen as a breach of good manners. Mustaches, after all, were not just hair. They were cultural fixtures, prized, perfumed, and protected. The wax and the worry. To understand why this invention caught on so widely, you have to consider the daily ordeal of mustache maintenance. Victorian men often used waxes and pomades to curl and fix their mustaches in place, especially with the styles of the time: the handlebar, the imperial, or the sharply groomed English mustache. Wax was applied carefully and repeatedly. Some waxes were handmade from beeswax and oil, others came from specialized chemists. Holding the desired shape required effort and time. And all of it could be undone by a single misjudged sip of tea. Many mustache styles sat directly atop the upper lip. The wax would soften in heat, and the delicate shape could droop or uncurl. Worse, once soaked in liquid, the mustache might acquire an unpleasant smell or glisten unattractively. So the mustache cup was insurance, a tool of masculine preservation. Even humorists of the time took note. In an 1874 issue of Punch, a cartoon depicted a flustered gentleman lamenting, "To drink is to destroy, to sip is to suffer, but with a guard I remain a man." Spread across the empire. Like many Victorian fashions, the mustache cup spread with the reach of the British Empire. Colonial officers stationed in India, Africa, and Southeast Asia adopted the item as part of their mess kit essentials. Indian craftsmen even began producing locally decorated mustache cups, blending European porcelain designs with indigenous motifs, floral patterns, elephants, Mughal scrollwork. In the United States, mustache cups became common in hotels and railway cars. By the 1880s, American potteries were producing their own versions, often more robust and rustic. In Germany and Austria, where porcelain manufacturing thrived, mustache cups were produced by the hundreds of thousands, often with decorative gilding and romantic phrases. These cups were not just about hygiene or utility. They became artifacts of Victorian masculinity, reflecting a time when ritual, self-presentation, and function all collided at the rim of a teacup. But as with so many innovations of the Victorian age, their prominence did not last, because eventually the mustache itself began to fade. What happened to the cup when the face it served went bare? The end of the mustache's reign. By the turn of the 20th century, a quiet but noticeable shift was taking place in men's grooming habits across Europe and North America. The once proud mustache, so carefully curled, waxed, and defended by porcelain ledges, was beginning to fall out of fashion. The causes were complex. Aesthetic trends are rarely the product of a single influence. But for the mustache, several powerful cultural and historical forces converged to erode its status. Medical hygiene movements. As germ theory gained traction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, so did public concern over personal cleanliness. Facial hair, especially bushy mustaches, began to be viewed by some medical professionals as harbors for bacteria, particularly in professions like food service, medicine, and law enforcement. Though this concern was more perception than proven science, it began to shift attitudes. Clean-shaven faces were considered modern, hygienic, and professional. Military shifts. Paradoxically, the military, which had once required mustaches, also helped phase them out. By the time of World War I, modern warfare demanded new forms of discipline and uniformity. Gas masks, in particular, required a tight facial seal impossible to achieve with large mustaches. Armies began encouraging or requiring soldiers to shave their upper lips. The battlefield had no time for wax or vanity, and when these men returned home, their new appearance often stuck. The rise of the safety razor. Invented by King C. Gillette in 1901, the safety razor brought easy, painless shaving to the masses. Until then, straight razors had made facial hair management a time-consuming and sometimes dangerous task. With the safety razor, men could shave quickly and regularly. This invention contributed to a new ideal of masculine grooming: smooth, efficient, and clean-cut. And so, little by little, the mustache became less dominant. Some styles persisted, of course. Certain artistic and aristocratic circles maintained their facial flair, but the mustache was no longer the default. It was now a choice, and increasingly a rare one. What of the cup? As mustaches receded, the mustache guard cup began to look increasingly peculiar. A man sipping from a guarded cup without facial hair looked affected, or even silly. In an era increasingly characterized by functional modernism, the ornate porcelain cups with their floral patterns, mottos, and curled ledges began to feel out of step with the times. By the 1920s, production of mustache cups had slowed dramatically. In the decades that followed, they became a curiosity. Stored in the backs of china cabinets, laughed at by children visiting grandparents, sold in antique markets under labels like Victorian oddity or gentleman's teacup. Many were discarded altogether. Others were misidentified as women's cups, with the guard mistaken for a barrier to prevent lipstick smudges. Few people remembered their true purpose. But even as they fell out of use, mustache cups remained surprisingly common in estates, attics, and second-hand shops, a testament to just how widespread they once were. In this quiet decline, we see the full arc of the object, from necessity to ritual to novelty to obscurity. And yet the story wasn't quite finished. The collector's renaissance. By the late 20th century, a strange thing happened. As with many lost objects of the Victorian era, the mustache cup experienced a revival not in function, but in fascination. Antique dealers began listing them as collectible items. Historians and material culture specialists started including them in exhibitions about gender, grooming, and etiquette. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London catalogued several ornate examples. In the United States, a few enthusiastic collectors began specializing in mustache cups, gathering hundreds from different countries, manufacturers, and decades. Some cups are now highly valued, especially those made by Royal Worcester, Meissen, Limoges, Staffordshire, or featuring military or political iconography. These cups offer a material window into 19th century masculinity, a subject often overlooked or flattened by broader historical narratives. After all, objects usually associated with male history tend to be weapons, tools, or political paraphernalia. But the mustache cup, it was intimate, personal, and even vulnerable. It served not the public man, but the private one. And in that sense, its survival into the present as a collectible is poetic. Modern revivals in irony. There has even been, in the 21st century, a small resurgence of facial hair culture, particularly among hipsters and retro fashion enthusiasts. With it came the occasional revival of the mustache cup, though often with tongue firmly in cheek. Modern versions have been manufactured for novelty purposes, often bearing cheeky phrases or exaggerated designs. Some Etsy sellers craft hand-thrown ceramic mustache mugs for contemporary bearded tea drinkers. A few high-end barbershops even offer vintage-style grooming kits that include replica cups. But these modern versions are more nods to nostalgia than genuine necessity. The problems of the Victorian mustache, its rigidity, the fragility of wax, the strict social codes no longer apply. Yet the revival tells us something, that in our rush towards sleek minimalism, we sometimes crave the charm of absurd specificity, the kind of invention born not of market surveys, but of daily human experience. Of a man with a mustache, just trying to drink his tea in peace. The quiet value of silly solutions. From today's perspective, the mustache guard cup may seem laughably niche. Why invent an entirely new form of porcelain just to solve such a minor problem? But perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps we should ask, what does the mustache cup teach us? It shows us that people once cared deeply about the rituals of presentation, that an entire social class responded to a grooming inconvenience not with avoidance, but with design. It reminds us that comfort and dignity, however small the stakes, have long driven invention. And it offers a tiny rebellion against the idea that everything must serve a grand purpose. The mustache cup was modest, domestic, and even frivolous, but it mattered to those who used it. What other inventions, lost or hidden, were born of similarly quiet needs? The object that captured an era. By the end of the Victorian period, the mustache cup had completed a curious journey from clever utility to cultural relic. While it never made headlines, never altered the course of wars or political power, it nonetheless holds a peculiar kind of historical significance. The mustache cup captures a specific moment in history, a time when ritual mattered more than convenience, when daily grooming was a visible sign of character, when even the act of drinking tea was filtered through social codes of decorum, hygiene, and image. It's easy to view this as absurd, a fragile cup with a built-in lip meant to protect a handlebar mustache. But history is full of such inventions. The objects that appear silly in hindsight are often the most honest expressions of daily life in their time. They solve small problems. They whisper the details that textbooks leave out. And the mustache cup, of all things, reminds us that every age has its own peculiar logic. What it tells us about masculinity. We often think of 19th century masculinity as stoic, hardened, and utilitarian. But the mustache cup tells a more nuanced story. It speaks to a Victorian man who was attentive to his appearance, vulnerable to embarrassment, conscious of his public presentation, willing to embrace a specialized object in defense of something so fragile as mustache wax. In that way, the mustache cup is an artifact of masculine delicacy. It reveals that Victorian men, like women, operated within strict social parameters, and that deviation, even accidental, could have consequences for one's image. The guard cup, then, becomes more than porcelain. It becomes a symbol of the invisible pressures of refinement. The decline and rebirth of niche design. The cup's decline also speaks to a larger historical pattern. How niche objects brilliant in their specificity rarely survive rapid cultural change. When mustaches disappeared, the mustache cup had no alternate function. Its utility was too closely tied to a vanished problem. There was no market for it, no adaptation path. And yet today, we are once again surrounded by niche tools for niche habits. Screen protectors for folding phones, silicone molds for artisanal ice spheres, USB hand warmers for office workers. Like the mustache cup, these items reflect the habits and anxieties of a particular moment. And like the mustache cup, many of them will vanish when fashion, lifestyle, or technology evolves. But while they last, they tell us who we are, what we value, what we're trying to preserve. A reflection on modern equivalents. In today's world, where disposable coffee cups, bottled beverages, and on-the-go lifestyles dominate, the ritual of the mustache cup may seem alien. Who has time for specialized crockery? But we do still design for the body. Think of beard oils and shaping tools that echo mustache waxes. Travel mugs with angled spouts, carefully designed to prevent coffee spills on beards. Face mask guards that protect makeup or facial hair during pandemics. Design is still responding to how we wear our faces. The mustache cup was simply one of the earliest and most charming examples of that tradition. It belonged to an age when fashion was precise, personal, and time-consuming. When a man might spend 20 minutes curling his mustache and then sip tea through a porcelain slot just to protect his work. It was an era when even the most mundane acts like drinking required tools of care and ceremony. And while that era has passed, the mustache cup remains as its soft-spoken ambassador. What the mustache cup left behind. In the end, the mustache cup didn't change the world, but it preserved it in miniature. It holds quite literally the shape of a forgotten custom. It freezes in porcelain a fleeting social rule, and it reminds us that behind every object, no matter how small, is a web of human behavior, desires, fears, routines, and rituals. A cup with a guard for a mustache. Silly, perhaps, but also deeply human. It is not a device of war or empire or revolution. It is a quiet invention, a domestic one, and in that it may be the most revealing kind of artifact we have. One sip at a time, it speaks across the years. Story 5. The pedestrian hobby horse when walking was rebranded as a sport. The strange case of walking for sport. In the age before mass-produced bicycles, before automobiles clogged roads, and before the treadmill made walking something done indoors, there was a brief but fascinating era when simply walking was not only transportation, but entertainment, fashionable exercise, and in some corners, a competitive sport. This was the world into which the pedestrian hobby horse was born, a curious, human-powered contraption that blurred the line between walking and riding. It was not quite a bicycle. It had no pedals, no chains, and no gears. And yet, it moved its user faster than a walk and more gracefully than a run. It was part fashion, part science, part gimmick, and very Victorian. To understand its appeal, one must first understand a time when walking itself was a cultural obsession. Pedestrianism, a Victorian craze. In the early 19th century, pedestrianism was a phenomenon. Competitive long-distance walking events some lasting days drew crowds in the tens of thousands. These were not leisurely strolls. They were brutal, sleep-deprived exhibitions of endurance and grit. Walkers known as heel-and-toe men would circle dirt tracks or city squares, sometimes for 24 hours straight, often wagering on distances or times. Famous pedestrians like Captain Barclay became household names. His feat of walking 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours in 1809 earned him both fame and a tidy fortune. These events captivated a public fascinated with human endurance in the same way we watch ultramarathons or extreme sports today. There were rules, judges, and strict dress codes. And out of this culture came a more genteel, fashionable version of walking, the promenade or taking the air. For upper and middle-class Victorians, walking became a ritual of refinement and opportunity to display one's clothing, posture, and character. But for some, walking wasn't enough. They wanted something faster, something more exhilarating. And so, the pedestrian hobby horse appeared. The Lofmoskyne, the original hobby horse. The true origin of the hobby horse dates back to 1817, with the invention of the Lofmoskyne, literally running machine, by Karl Dries, a German baron. This early form of the bicycle had 2 wheels, handlebars, and a saddle but no pedals. The rider propelled themselves by pushing their feet along the ground, much like a child's balance bike today. Dries's invention became known as the Draisine or velocipede, but in England it was affectionately, and sometimes mockingly, referred to as the hobby horse. It was a peculiar sight. Well-dressed gentlemen gliding along roads and pathways on wooden frames with iron wheels, legs kicking backward in rhythmic strides, like mounted walkers. The devices were embraced by fashionable society in the 1820s, particularly in cities like London, Bath, and Edinburgh. Men and some daring women would use them in parks or promenades, often drawing attention and admiration. Though crude by modern standards, the hobby horse represented a revolutionary shift in personal mobility. Walking enhanced. Why did the hobby horse appeal so strongly to Victorians? The answer lies in the strange tension between movement and propriety. Victorian fashion was restrictive. Men wore stiff collars and heavy coats. Women wore corsets, petticoats, and long skirts. Walking could be a chore, but the hobby horse offered fluid movement with minimal exertion. It was also silent, unlike horses, which clattered and snorted, or carriages, which jostled and jolted. The hobby horse was smooth and controlled, giving its rider a sense of effortless gliding. It was movement without sweat, perfect for the image-conscious pedestrian. And most importantly, it didn't require feeding, stabling, or grooming. In a society obsessed with appearances and efficiency, the hobby horse was an elegant compromise. As one London newspaper quipped in 1821, "The gentleman arrives not a minute winded, nor his steed lathered both as fresh as when they set out." The fall and rise again. But as with many novelties, the hobby horse had its critics. City officials began to ban them from pedestrian walkways, citing safety concerns. Riders, it turned out, were not always as graceful as they imagined. The iron-shod wheels tore up gravel paths and collisions were common. Satirists had a field day. Caricatures in Punch showed puffed-up men astride absurd wooden steeds, legs flailing behind them, as startled dogs and ladies leapt aside. The phrase hobby horsing became shorthand for any foolish fad. By the late 1820s, the pedestrian hobby horse had mostly vanished from parks and boulevards. But its story wasn't over. Decades later, with improvements in metallurgy, mechanics, and urban planning, the concept would re-emerge refined and reimagined. It would evolve into the bicycle, first the bone shaker. then the penny farthing, and eventually the chain-driven safety bicycle that revolutionized transportation in the late 19th century. But in between those chapters, the pedestrian hobby horse would take on one final, strange Victorian identity as a tool of health, reform, and moral walking. Because even when the streets no longer welcomed them, the idea behind the hobby horse found its way into schools, rehabilitation centers, and moral instruction manuals. How did a walking aid become a symbol of physical virtue and social order? Movement as medicine. As the 19th century progressed, Victorian society underwent a profound transformation in how it thought about the human body. No longer seen merely as a vessel for labor or fashion, the body became a subject of regulation, health science, and social reform. Doctors, educators, and social theorists alike began to stress the importance of physical exercise not for pleasure, necessarily, but for discipline, moral rectitude, and self-improvement. It was in this environment that the pedestrian hobby horse, though largely out of favor as a mode of stylish transport, found an unlikely second life. As a tool for controlled locomotion, corrective movement, and even rehabilitative therapy. In schools, asylums, and health reform centers, the hobby horse returned less flamboyant, more utilitarian. The hobby horse in education. By the 1850s and 60s, some British and continental educators had adopted a modified form of the hobby horse to teach children balance, posture, and proper gait. These versions were simpler and sturdier than the earlier fashionable models, with lower saddles, suitable for younger riders, rubber-lined wheels, for use indoors or on schoolyard stone, guidance poles or rails, in case correction was needed. The goal wasn't transport, it was discipline through motion. Children were instructed to use the devices in straight lines, maintaining an upright posture, with chins high and backs straight. Teachers monitored for slouching, wobbling, or vulgar sprinting. 1867 Handbook for Educational Physical Culture in Manchester noted, "The walking velocipede, in encouraging posture and pace, shall be used twice weekly among the male pupils, under the master's supervision. Flaring of the elbows or imbalance shall result in corrective instruction." In short, the hobby horse became a walking tutor, reinforcing ideals of grace, restraint, and controlled physicality. And while girls were often excluded from such exercises, in some progressive institutions, adapted versions were permitted, usually under strict chaperoning. This use of the hobby horse reflected the Victorian obsession with shaping not just minds, but bodies. The therapeutic turn. At the same time, in hospitals and asylums, hobby horse-like devices began to appear as early forms of physical therapy equipment. In one case documented at a private rehabilitation institute in Bath, convalescing soldiers and factory workers were guided along smooth pathways on small wheeled hobby horses, encouraged to regain muscle strength and balance after injuries. These were not playthings, but instruments of recovery. Therapists observed the rhythm of the patient's stride, the engagement of core and limb muscles, and the degree of control. The idea was that the body could relearn walking through this assisted simulation, providing support without full mechanical intervention like a wheelchair. For patients suffering from neurological conditions or trauma-induced imbalance, the pedestrian hobby horse offered a rare combination: mobility, structure, and self-determination. 1874 Medical Journal entry described it as a mechanism of balance, enabling the patient to reenact the memory of locomotion, and thus reassert mastery over the lower limbs. This therapeutic use reveals something striking. An object once ridiculed in the parks of London had been quietly repurposed as a device of dignity, a bridge between stillness and strength. The moral underpinnings of motion. Of course, in Victorian England, few things were purely practical. The use of the hobby horse in education and therapy also carried moral overtones. Walking itself had always been linked to moral character. A slow, even gait suggested restraint. A hurried or erratic pace implied disorder. A proper stroll was not just physical, it was a measure of self-discipline. So, devices that regulated movement like the hobby horse were imbued with greater meaning. They became tools for instilling not only balance, but behavior. It's no accident that many health reformers who championed the use of structured physical movement also preached about sobriety, industry, and obedience. For them, a man who could walk upright was not just healthy, he was virtuous. This worldview was especially evident in institutions where moral deviance was seen as both a physical and mental failing. In such settings, the hobby horse became a device of correction as much as recovery. An 1882 Reform School manual advised that boys showing inattentive posture or mechanical laziness should be given extra time on the walking device to re-establish discipline through limb and mind. In this sense, the hobby horse had become a moral machine. The odd intersection of technology and etiquette. The Victorian era was full of inventions that sat at the crossroads of technology and manners. From the mustache cup to the writing telegraph, these devices emerged to solve highly specific social problems, and in doing so, they told us something about the age. The pedestrian hobby horse was no different. It was a machine of movement but not freedom. It encouraged travel but only within boundaries. It empowered but only within frameworks of propriety and improvement. In its second life as a physical and moral aid, it became a mirror of Victorian ideals. That motion must have meaning, that the body must be regulated, and that even leisure could be disciplinary. A decline without drama. By the end of the 19th century, the rise of the modern bicycle with pedals, chains, and pneumatic tires had rendered the hobby horse obsolete in both recreation and rehabilitation. Bicycles were faster, smoother, and more universally adopted. They too were moralized for a time, but ultimately found their place in practical transport. The hobby horse, meanwhile, faded again, this time not as a fashion failure, but as an outgrown tool. Its remaining use in therapy continued for a while, eventually replaced by more advanced physical therapy equipment. But it left behind traces. In schoolyard games, where scooters and balance bikes echoed its form. In occupational therapy, where upright mobility aids borrow its structure. And in our memory of strange contraptions that once turned the most basic human activity, walking into an act of deliberate engineering. The pedestrian hobby horse had one more evolution left in it. But to understand that final chapter, we must turn to how it was remembered, reinvented, and even reimagined in the 20th century, not as a machine of virtue, but as a curiosity of history. From obsolescence to oddity. By the early 20th century, the pedestrian hobby horse had largely vanished from everyday life. Its use in stylish promenades had been replaced by the bicycle and, increasingly, the motor car. Its function in rehabilitation gave way to more sophisticated physiotherapy equipment. Its moral associations faded with the rise of new ideas about leisure, health, and mobility. And so, for several decades, the hobby horse lived only in memory, an antique curiosity seen in dusty museum corners, whimsical illustrations, or the odd footnote in books about early bicycles. It became a symbol of obsolescence, a wooden relic, quaint and impractical, evoking the excesses and eccentricities of a society that once engineered a riding device just to walk a little more efficiently. But as the century wore on, something unexpected happened. The pedestrian hobby horse didn't return to daily life. But it refused to die. The rise of the balance bike. In the 1990s and early 2000s, A growing movement in early childhood education began rethinking how children learn to ride bicycles. Instead of training wheels and heavy pedal mechanisms, some educators and manufacturers began promoting balance bikes' two-wheeled frames with no pedals, where children could sit and push along with their feet, just like the original hobby horse. The idea was simple. If children learned balance and steering first, pedaling could come later. This method proved effective. Children as young as 2 could navigate balance bikes confidently, and by the time they transitioned to pedal bikes, they often did so without training wheels at all. The modern balance bike is typically made of lightweight materials, plastic, aluminum, or wood with rubber wheels, ergonomic saddles, and safety grips. But at its core, it is a direct descendant of the 1817 Drayson and the Victorian hobby horse. The name balance bike may have replaced hobby horse, but the function is virtually identical. And in toy shops around the world, thousands of children now learn to ride the same way well-dressed Victorian gentlemen once glided through Hyde Park. It's a full-circle moment, a forgotten innovation returning in the form of a child's first wheeled freedom. Historical reenactments and hobbyist culture. Meanwhile, in historical circles, the pedestrian hobby horse has gained a new kind of attention. Reenactment societies, bicycle history enthusiasts, and industrial design students have built and ridden replica hobby horses, either as part of museum displays or public exhibitions. Some of these reconstructions are functional. Others are deliberately stylized to emphasize the oddness of the original design. In these demonstrations, audiences laugh, marvel, and sometimes reflect on how an invention that once seemed so of the future now looks amusingly antiquated. But that's the pattern of technology, isn't it? What begins as novelty becomes necessity, and what is outgrown becomes charming. The hobby horse, in its earliest and simplest form, invented an entire category of transport that now spans continents and generations. From the velocipede to the racing bicycle to the child's first scooter, the central idea remains: a human-powered vehicle that augments walking while preserving the rider's agency. Lessons in human-centered design. Looking back, the pedestrian hobby horse offers more than amusement. It offers lessons in how we design for the body and how technology intersects with habit, culture, and behavior. Consider what the hobby horse accomplished. It extended the natural motion of walking. It required no external power. It respected the posture and clothing of its time. It was accessible to anyone who could stride. Its downfall wasn't that it didn't work, it was that society moved on, favoring faster, more versatile machines. But for its brief moment in the sun, the hobby horse was a perfect fit. Modern designers might take inspiration from this. The best innovations don't always need to be complicated. Sometimes, the simplest improvements to familiar actions are the ones that truly resonate. In that light, the hobby horse wasn't a failed bicycle. It was a successful prototype of personal mobility. A humble invention, a grand legacy. In a quiet way, the pedestrian hobby horse helped bridge two worlds. A world in which humans relied entirely on legs and animals for movement. And a world where wheels, guided by human will, began to reshape our cities, our routines, and our sense of speed. And though it was overshadowed by its descendants, it laid the foundation. Every cyclist, every child on a scooter, every runner who uses a balance aid in rehab, all of them inherit something from that wooden frame with two wheels and no pedals. It was a machine that taught people how to move, how to glide, how to trust their balance, and perhaps how to laugh at themselves too. Because yes, it looked a bit ridiculous. But then again, so do many great inventions at first. Story 6. The anti-garrote collar when street crime sparked fashionable armor. London, 1850s, a city on edge. Picture London in the mid-19th century. gas lamps flickering over damp cobblestones, the air thick with fog and soot. It's a city teeming with opportunity and danger, where the working poor and upper classes exist side by side, often separated by just a brick wall or a shadowed alley. Crime was rampant. The Industrial Revolution had drawn thousands into the city, creating overcrowded slums, unemployment, and desperation. The press filled its columns with tales of thieves, pickpockets, and most disturbingly garroters. A new kind of criminal had emerged in London streets: the garroter, a footpad who attacked victims by strangling or choking them from behind, rendering them unconscious before robbing them and fleeing. It was a crime that was quick, effective, and terrifyingly silent. Unlike the well-dressed highwayman or the classic burglar, the garroter was largely invisible until it was too late. They favored darkness, doorways, alleys, and struck with stealth and efficiency. And for Victorian London, where order and decorum were paramount, this sudden, intimate violence was deeply unsettling. It wasn't just a crime against the body. It was a crime against the gentlemanly ideal. The Panic of 1862. Though garroting had existed in some form for decades, it reached public hysteria after a series of high-profile attacks in 1862, the most famous being against Hugh Pilkington, a member of Parliament. Pilkington was walking along Jermyn Street, a relatively respectable area, when he was attacked, throttled from behind, and robbed. The press seized upon the story with gusto. His status made the crime more than a mugging; it became a symbolic breach of public safety. Suddenly, no one felt safe. The newspapers dubbed it the garrote panic. Sensational headlines warned of criminal gangs lying in wait around every lamppost. Satirical cartoons depicted gentlemen being seized by monstrous thugs, while the police looked the other way. Rumors spread that criminals were now using wire or nooses to permanently disable their victims. The panic escalated quickly, and so did the response. The government rushed through harsher sentencing laws, increasing prison terms and even reintroducing flogging for violent street crime. But legal reform wasn't fast enough for the general public. So Victorian gentlemen took matters into their own hands, literally around their own necks. And thus the anti-garrote collar was born, the invention of defensive fashion. At first glance, the anti-garrote collar seems absurd, a fashion accessory turned weapon defense system, but to Victorians, it was an entirely rational response to a specific threat. The device was essentially a reinforced collar, often made of steel, thick leather, or rigid iron plates worn under or integrated into a gentleman's standard high-collared shirt or cravat. The collar was designed to resist or deflect pressure around the neck, preventing a garroter's cord or hands from fully tightening. Some collars were rigid and uncomfortable, others were more elaborate. Spring-loaded spikes that would extend if the wearer was grabbed. Alarm whistles or bells built into the collar to draw attention. Some even had detachable metal blades or studs, a kind of passive retaliation device. One popular model, sold under the brand name, the Garrote Guard, featured a steel crescent insert sewn into a detachable neckband. The idea was simple. Any attempt to choke the wearer would be thwarted by an immovable frame. Some versions extended over the back of the neck and upper shoulders almost like a miniature gorget, harkening back to medieval armor. It was defense by fashion, or fashion by necessity. The design varied, but the purpose was singular. Do not let anyone take your breath or your wallet. Commercializing the fear. Victorian entrepreneurs were quick to capitalize on the hysteria. Advertisements for anti-garrote collars appeared in newspapers and gentlemen's magazines. They used fear as a selling point, warning of the fate that could strike any honest man in an alley or even broad daylight. Shops began selling gentlemen's defensive kits, which included a steel-lined collar, a walking cane with a hidden blade or weighted head, a concealed whistle or alarm device, and sometimes brass knuckles, discreetly sized to fit in a waistcoat pocket. One ad from 1863 read, "Protect thy neck and thine honor with the patented garrote-proof collar, warranted against strangulation, recommended by officers, bankers, and the fearful alike." While some of these devices were more marketing than merit, they tapped into a very real psychological need: control over personal vulnerability. In a society where masculinity was tied to public composure and dignity, the idea of being attacked from behind rendered helpless was not just terrifying, it was humiliating. The anti-garrote collar became a way to reclaim that control. It wasn't just protection, it was peace of mind. Fashion meets fear. In time, these devices sparked debate. Satirical papers mocked the trend, publishing illustrations of men walking stiff-necked through London like ironclad turtles. Critics derided it as hysteria disguised as heroism. Some conservative columnists accused the collars of undermining the natural bravery of the English gentleman. Still, demand remained strong throughout the 1860s. Tailors began integrating protective elements into high collars. Upper-class dandies, never ones to miss a fashion opportunity, commissioned ornate versions collars embossed with floral motifs or etched initials over the metal shell. The idea spread beyond London. In Paris, similar designs emerged, particularly among the nouveau rich who feared the city's lower quarters. In New York, where garroting had also been reported in immigrant neighborhoods, American papers picked up the story, sometimes with admiration, sometimes mockery. Yet the question lingered: did these collars actually work? Or were they symbols of paranoia, placebos for a public unwilling to accept the randomness of urban crime? Did it actually work? The idea of a collar that could stop a strangler seems both comic and ingenious. But did anti-garrote collars really prevent attacks? Contemporary accounts are mixed. Some newspaper articles in the 1860s reported alleged saves, where men wearing reinforced collars claimed they had been attacked and had escaped injury or theft. These reports, often anecdotal and sometimes suspiciously close to product advertisements, described attackers being thwarted by a sudden resistance or startled by the clink of iron. In reality, it's likely that most attacks were over before a collar could make much difference. Garroters struck quickly, often using coordinated distractions, such as a shove from one accomplice followed by the choke from another. By the time a collar could help, the victim was typically already on the ground or unconscious. Still, these collars had deterrent value. Some wore them openly, making the stiff edges of steel or iron slightly visible above the collar line. In this way, the collar became not just protection, but warning, a visible sign that the wearer was not an easy target. Think of it as the Victorian equivalent of a home security sign. Whether or not the system works perfectly is beside the point. Its presence reshapes the behavior of those who might test it. In this sense, the anti-garrote collar had a second function beyond physical defense. It restored confidence. In a society gripped by panic, that alone was worth the price. The social dimensions of neck armor. The emergence of the anti-garrote collar also highlighted growing class tensions in Victorian society. It was, after all, a defensive measure designed primarily for middle and upper-class men, those who walked through rougher neighborhoods or passed from theater to club in the evening. The press often framed garroting as a threat from the dangerous poor, a symptom of the perceived lawlessness of London slums. Wearing an anti-garrote collar became not just a safety measure, but a class signal. It was an acknowledgement that one's person and property were worth guarding, that one had something to lose. The poor, of course, had no such luxuries. They walked the same streets, often in greater numbers, but without the benefit of steel neckwear or alarmed accessories. Their exposure to violence was far greater, yet far less documented. Thus, in its strange way, the collar symbolized a wider divide, a city physically mingled, yet socially partitioned. Safety, even in something as intimate as a shirt collar, became another expression of privilege. A brief but loud moment in fashion. For several years after 1862, the anti-garrote collar remained an object of public fascination. It was featured in music hall skits, cartoons, and novelty gift shops. Satirical artists had a field day. One famous Punch cartoon from 1863 depicted a London gentleman with an absurdly high collar rising to his ears, dotted with spikes and labeled like armor. His walking stick bore a blade, his hat bristled with nails, and a note at his side read, "The Modern Promenade Ensemble." Mockery did little to slow sales. In fact, satire may have boosted the collar's appeal by making it more visible. People love to laugh at gadgets, but they also secretly admire them. A gentleman seen wearing such a collar might seem overly cautious, but also clever, prepared, even heroic in his vigilance. Manufacturers capitalized on this duality. Some even leaned into the comedy by producing ladies' anti-garrote collarettes, which were dainty, decorative versions with hidden metal bands intended for women walking with their maids after dusk. Though far less common, their existence speaks to how pervasive the panic had become and how deeply the collar had embedded itself in the culture of urban self-defense. The decline of the panic. Like most public hysterias, the garrote panic eventually fizzled out. By the mid-1860s, increased police presence in key areas, harsher sentencing, and a genuine reduction in reported attacks calmed the city. Whether crime truly declined, or whether people simply stopped talking about it, is hard to say. But the fear passed. And with it, so did the need for specialized neck armor. The anti-garrote collar became obsolete almost overnight. Newspapers stopped reporting attacks. Politicians stopped bringing up the issue. Shops quietly stopped stocking the items, and tailors returned to making cravats, not cuirasses. The few remaining collars were tucked away in wardrobes or, more often, became conversation pieces, oddities kept in the study or gifted as jokes between friends. Some were melted down or discarded altogether. A decade later, few would remember them with much seriousness. And yet, in those brief years, the anti-garrote collar had made a lasting impression not just on fashion, but on the Victorian psyche. It revealed a truth often ignored in the polished veneer of 19th-century decorum, that beneath the top hats and tails, the gentlemen of London carried a very real fear of being touched, of being vulnerable, of losing control. In that way, the collar was not just armor for the body. It was armor for the illusion of dignity. But what happens to a society when its sense of security must be worn, strapped around the throat like a warning? The symbolism of the collar. As the panic of garroting faded from the streets of London, so too did the need for physical neck protection. But the anti-garrote collar left behind more than metal inserts and comedic cartoons. It left behind a cultural imprint, a lesson in how people respond to fear, and how quickly everyday fashion can turn into functional defense. The Victorian gentleman, so often imagined as cool, composed, and inflexible, was in this moment something far more relatable, anxious, uncertain, and seeking control in a world that felt suddenly unpredictable. The anti-garrote collar, stiff, restrictive, and slightly absurd, represented a society grappling with the vulnerability of the body, especially the male body, in a rapidly changing world. It's a rare thing in fashion history to find such a direct expression of urban insecurity embedded in clothing. This wasn't symbolic armor, it was literal, and it was worn not by warriors, but by clerks, bankers, and members of parliament. For a few short years, fashion had metal teeth, worn just above the tie pin. Modern echoes of defensive dress. The anti-garrote collar might sound like a uniquely Victorian oddity, But the idea of clothing designed for personal protection has never gone away. If anything, the 20th and 21st centuries saw expansions of the idea. Bulletproof vests for dignitaries and law enforcement. Slash-proof linings in jackets for security personnel. Hidden armor panels sewn into luxury outerwear for high-net-worth individuals. Even anti-surveillance clothing, designed with reflective fabrics to defeat facial recognition. And in more everyday forms, we see psychological armor in fashion. Thick-soled shoes for stature. Power suits to project authority. Sunglasses as masks. Hoodies as shields. Each of these, in their way, is a descendant of the anti-garrote collar, a response to feeling watched, threatened, or simply exposed. Fashion is always more than fabric. It reflects what we fear and what we think we can control. Fear as a business model. The brief boom in anti-garrote products also tells us something about how fear is monetized. Victorian entrepreneurs didn't invent the fear of strangulation, but they packaged it, branded it, and sold it. They offered objects of reassurance, whether or not those objects delivered practical safety. This formula has proven enduring. In the Cold War, fallout shelters were sold to suburban families. In the 2000s, sales of pepper spray and personal alarms surged in cities worldwide. And in digital spaces, cybersecurity companies market to anxieties about identity theft and surveillance. The anti-garrote collar was an early physical expression of this pattern. When people are afraid, they will reach for whatever seems to offer protection, especially if that protection allows them to maintain their routine, their dignity, their sense of self. That's what made the collar so successful. It didn't require behavioral change. You could still walk the same streets, wear the same coats, attend the same theaters. You simply added a lining of iron beneath your cravat. You stayed civilized, just a little more armored. Forgotten, then remembered. Today, anti-garrote collars are rare objects. A few survive in museum collections, often mislabeled or misunderstood. Some appear in collections of eccentric Victorian inventions, displayed alongside pneumatic mail tubes, electrified grooming tools, or spring-loaded hatpins. But unlike those inventions, the anti-garrote collar has no spiritual successor. It didn't evolve into something more refined. It wasn't upgraded or repurposed. It was too specific. It answered a narrow, frightening moment in urban life, and once that moment passed, the collar had nowhere else to go. And yet, its sudden rise and fall leave us with a surprisingly modern question. How do we choose to protect ourselves when the threats around us feel invisible, unexpected, or deeply personal? We don't wear iron around our necks anymore, but we still armor up in subtler ways. In apps, in routines, in fashion, in distrust. The anti-garrote collar may seem like a joke, now an overwrought solution to a brief panic. But it was, in its time, a sincere attempt to preserve control, dignity, and safety in a world that suddenly felt too close. It was a collar against chaos. And while it may have disappeared from wardrobes, the desire behind it to be untouched by the hand in the dark remains all too familiar. Story 7. The Clockwork Servant when mechanical help promised domestic utopia. A house full of labor. In Victorian Britain, the home was not just a sanctuary, it was a symbol. A well-managed, orderly household reflected virtue, discipline, and status. But behind the parlor curtains and polished banisters, the truth was that keeping a household running required constant work. Servants were the invisible engine of middle and upper-class life. A single home might employ a cook, a housemaid, a parlor maid, a nursemaid, a butler, and perhaps even a scullery maid. It was expensive, demanding, and sometimes precarious. Employers worried about gossip, theft, competence, or even the moral tone of their staff. Servants, in turn, often worked grueling hours under harsh scrutiny. And so, in the age of steam, gears, and grand technological ambition, a question emerged in drawing rooms and workshops alike. Could the servant be replaced by a machine? Enter the clockwork servant, a concept that was part fantasy, part engineering experiment, and wholly Victorian in its mixture of ambition, absurdity, and anxiety. Imagining the mechanical maid. The idea of mechanical labor was not new. Automata, mechanical figures that moved or performed tasks, had been popular for centuries, particularly in France and Germany. These delicate, often elaborate devices could bow, write, or play instruments. But in the Victorian era, the notion of a machine that could perform domestic labor became more serious. No longer just novelties, machines were reshaping industry. Steam-powered looms, mechanical pumps, and early calculating devices were already revolutionizing factories and offices. Why not the home? The Victorian imagination began to flirt with the possibility of the mechanical domestic. In fiction, the idea appeared often. In short stories published in periodicals, in speculative essays about the house of the future, and in comedic sketches, imagining fussy butlers with winding keys in their backs. But some inventors took the idea quite literally. The real experiments, scattered through 19th century patent filings and engineering journals, are serious attempts to create mechanical aids for the home, early forerunners of the modern household robot. These included automatic tea servers, which used clockwork gears to pour hot water into a cup at a preset time. Mechanical bell ringers, programmed to chime hourly or summon household staff. Wheeled carts, guided by tracks or ropes, that carried items between rooms. And even proto-vacuum devices, hand-cranked or powered by bellows, designed to reduce dust. But the most ambitious designs attempted something bolder: anthropomorphic machines capable of imitating human tasks. One 1870s patent filed in London described a mechanical servant constructed from iron and brass, fitted with limbs moved by internal spring-driven clockwork, and designed to perform the serving of light refreshments and correspondence. The device was never mass-produced, but its conception reveals a growing desire to make domestic automation tangible. Engineers imagined wind-up devices that would bring slippers, pass letters, or carry trays. The dream was to eliminate the servant problem without sacrificing the rhythms of genteel living. The problem, of course, was complexity. Victorian technology could build machines that moved, but it couldn't build machines that understood, adapted, or anticipated human needs. At least not yet. Society's mixed feelings. While some embraced the idea of mechanical labor with enthusiasm, others reacted with suspicion. After all, the servant class was not just functional, it was deeply embedded in the social order. Replacing them with machines raised awkward questions. Would mechanical servants respect hierarchy? What would happen to real servants if machines took over? Could a wind-up maid ever understand discretion? Might a machine drop the good china? Satirical essays poked fun at the idea. One writer in the leisure hour imagined a mechanical butler who interpreted commands too literally and served guests hat boxes instead of hats. Another joked that a clockwork cook might explode if overwound before pudding. Even supporters of domestic automation recognized the risks. A badly tuned machine could embarrass its owner. Worse still, it might signal novelty chasing or poor taste rather than efficiency. As one etiquette columnist wrote in 1884, "There is a danger in becoming too enamored of machinery, lest one's household begin to resemble a railway station rather than a home." And yet, despite these warnings, the idea would not go away. Because underneath the laughter and satire was a very real longing, especially among the rising middle class, for labor without laborers, service without dependency, and order without conflict. The clockwork servant, however awkward, promised a future in which the inconveniences of human help might be smoothed out by springs, gears, and the elegant tick of automation. But how close did Victorians actually come to building one? And what did their dreams of mechanical labor reveal about their relationship to real servants? Mechanical precision, human problems. As the 19th century moved into its final decades, the Victorian obsession with order, punctuality, and self-discipline collided more forcefully than ever with the possibilities of machinery. The household, once a domain of unpredictable human behavior, became the next target for mechanical refinement. To truly grasp the depth of the Victorian imagination regarding the clockwork servant, we must examine what it was meant to replace. Real servants were indispensable, but they were also unreliable in the eyes of many employers, emotionally complicated due to the intimacy of shared space, and increasingly empowered thanks to labor movements and rising literacy. The idea of a servant who never talked back, never grew tired, never gossiped or erred this was not just a convenience. It was, for some, a fantasy of social control. The clockwork servant was not about innovation alone. It was about the removal of friction from domestic life. Tinkering toward automation. While no true humanoid, robot, servant was ever realized in the 19th century, Victorian inventors and enthusiasts came tantalizingly close in some key areas. 1. Mechanical waiters and serving devices. In upscale households, the appearance of automated serving carts was not uncommon. These were small, wheeled tables powered by hidden clockwork mechanisms or tracks beneath the floor. When wound, they would roll forward at a measured pace, carrying a decanter or dessert tray to a guest. One especially elaborate model, exhibited in Paris in the 1870s, used counterweights and gearing to ensure the cart adjusted for turns and corners. It was described in La Nature as the image of a modest footman, silent and sure, and incapable of complaint. Other devices featured timed pouring mechanisms, allowing a guest to place a cup under a spout and receive precisely one measure of sherry or tea. Though basic by today's standards, these machines fulfilled real household tasks and did so with style. 2. The writing machine and messenger automata. Inspired by the telegraphic and typing innovations of the time, some inventors crafted letter-writing machines and document-handling automata that mimicked human dexterity. An 1883 issue of Scientific American detailed a desk with an integrated clockwork arm that could be set to deliver a note from a drawer precisely at noon. The effect was not just practical, it was theatrical. While this didn't replace a servant, it evoked one. The performative aspect of mechanical precision, of having tasks completed at just the right moment, satisfied the Victorian love of ceremony and rhythm. 3. Clockwork dolls and anthropomorphic automata. More fancifully, clockwork humanoids continued to appear at exhibitions and private showcases. Many of these were crafted in France and Switzerland, famed for their precision clockmaking. Though primarily made as toys or curiosities, their capabilities were striking. A made doll that could hold a tray, walk a few paces, curtsy, and return. A figure that appeared to dust a table by rotating its arm with a tiny cloth. A sitting automaton that lifted a teacup to its mouth at regular intervals. Of course, these machines were extremely limited. They followed a fixed sequence of motions and couldn't react to their environment. But to the Victorian eye, they felt prophetic glimpses of what might one day be normal. And for those who hosted guests or displayed such machines in salons, they were statements of taste, wealth, and a belief in technological mastery over the domestic sphere. Servants respond. Not everyone admired these mechanical interlopers. Among domestic workers, the idea of mechanical replacements sparked everything from amusement to offense. Letters to the editor in periodicals occasionally poked at the issue. If the mistress wishes a brass doll to dust the drawing room, I dare say it will suit her, so long as it does not ask for wages. Letter from a housemaid, The Times, 1886. Such remarks reflected not just class tension, but a deep awareness that labor was being reimagined, not just redistributed. In many ways, the mechanical servant embodied employers' desire to depersonalize labor, to have the service without the relationship, the compliance without the conversation. It is no coincidence that this period also saw increased publication of household management manuals, which taught women how to train servants like machines when to ring bells, how to set schedules, what phrases to use. The goal was domestic order by design, whether the worker was human or gear-driven. The machine as moral symbol. Interestingly, some thinkers of the period saw clockwork servants not as threats, but as moral exemplars. Writers in journals like the Fortnightly Review mused that mechanical behavior routine, reliability, obedience was preferable to the unpredictable moods and inconsistencies of human staff. This mirrored broader Victorian ideas that virtue was found in regularity. The good person was like a clock, dependable, modest, and always ticking forward without deviation. To these observers, machines were not just useful, they were morally superior. Of course, this was fantasy. Even the finest clockwork could break down, springs jammed, gears wore out, nothing was truly perpetual. But the idea persisted, that the home of the future would run like clockwork not just in metaphor, but in literal motion, one where laborers, emotions, and surprises were all eliminated in favor of predictable mechanical grace. The unanswered question. The Victorian clockwork servant, as both concept and prototype, ultimately posed a larger philosophical question. Can service exist without humanity? The dream of the mechanical domestic helper was seductive. No wages, no errors, no inconvenient personalities. But it also stripped the act of service of care, of attention, of human presence, of everything that made it personal. What was left was efficiency and silence. A tray delivered with no smile, a letter passed with no nod, tasks completed but with no feeling. As Victorians tiptoed toward the 20th century, some began to wonder whether the pursuit of mechanical perfection came at the cost of something unmeasurable. Because what is a household without the heartbeat of those who fill it? The invention that never arrived. Despite all the sketches, prototypes, patents, and parlor fantasies, the fully functioning clockwork servant, a machine able to perform multiple household duties with human-like dexterity, never materialized in the Victorian era. It wasn't for lack of imagination, nor even for lack of mechanical ingenuity. Rather, it was a matter of technological limits. The mechanisms required to perform dynamic tasks, grasping a fragile teacup, navigating around furniture, responding to unexpected events, were far beyond what gears, springs, and pulleys could manage in the 19th century. The fantasy of the perfect mechanical helper had outpaced the tools available to build it. And so, while elements of the dream survived in automata, novelty devices, and speculative fiction, the clockwork servant as a practical reality quietly faded from serious discussion. By the end of the century, even the most enthusiastic hobbyists had begun to see it for what it was, a metaphor more than a machine. But the metaphor was powerful. It spoke not only to Victorian ambitions, but also to their anxieties, their wish to remove conflict, control labor, and make life predictable in an unpredictable world. And so, the clockwork servant disappeared, but the desire for it did not. Into the 20th century, from winding keys to wires. The 20th century saw a transformation in how people thought about labor-saving technology. No longer confined to delicate gears and ornate brass, the new innovations were electric, mass-produced, and aimed at middle-class homes. Where the clockwork servant had failed, the appliance succeeded. The electric vacuum replaced the manual carpet sweeper. The automatic toaster replaced kitchen guesswork. The washing machine, the fridge, the microwave, each one took over a task once performed by a person. These machines didn't mimic humans in form. They weren't built to walk or curtsy, but they did exactly what the clockwork servant promised. They reduced domestic dependence on human labor. In this way, the spirit of the clockwork servant survived, just not in its original body. Even today, echoes remain. The arrival of robotic vacuums, AI-driven personal assistants, self-driving appliances, each iteration revisits the core Victorian fantasy. A servant that needs no rest, holds no opinions, and blends seamlessly into the background of daily life. The winding key has become the microchip, but the dream remains the same. Looking back, what the clockwork servant meant. In its brief moment of historical attention, the clockwork servant offered something unusual, a direct look into the Victorian mind, not its factories or inventions, but its hopes. It revealed how Victorians thought about labor, hierarchy, gender roles, and the boundaries between public and private life. It raised questions that are still with us today. If we can automate a task, should we? Does convenience justify erasing human presence? When service becomes invisible, what else do we lose? It also reminded us that innovation isn't always about function. Sometimes it's about reassurance. The Victorians didn't just want help in the home. They wanted certainty, discipline, and a reflection of their social values in every corner of domestic life. The clockwork servant was a promise that the household could be as organized as a train schedule, as obedient as a wind-up doll, and as free from human complexity as a well-oiled machine. It never arrived, but the longing never left. A quiet ending. Today, in quiet corners of museums, you might find a relic of this lost dream. A tin automaton with brass hinges, posed mid-bow, forever serving a cup of tea to no one. It does not move. Its gears are rusted, its purpose forgotten. But if you watch it long enough, you might see what the Victorians saw. Not just a machine, but a mirror. A glimpse of a society trying to build not just comfort, but control. Trying to replace not just labor, but the complications of being served. And in doing so, asking a question that still lingers. Can we ever truly replace the human element without losing something else entirely? Story 8. The Pneumatic Dispatch, Victorian London's underground tube of air. The origins of the idea. In the middle of the 19th century, London was choking not just on coal smoke and fog, but on paper. As the British Empire expanded, so too did the demands on communication. Letters, invoices, parliamentary notices, court summons, business reports, and newspaper proofs all needed to travel quickly across the sprawling capital. But the streets were a mess, congested with carts, omnibuses, and foot traffic. Delivery boys weaved dangerously between carriages, and horse-drawn mail coaches were frequently delayed by weather, traffic, or sheer human density. The growing postal burden needed a new kind of network, something faster than feet, less expensive than trains, and more reliable than weather-bound messengers. Enter the idea of pneumatic dispatch. Not a metaphor, but quite literally, a dispatch system powered by air. It sounds like science fiction, and in most parts of the world it was. But in Victorian London, it was an idea so plausible, so urgent, and so grand that they actually built it, underground. A whispering network of iron tubes, shuttling messages by air pressure at 30 miles per hour beneath the boots and bustle of the greatest city on Earth. From toy to transportation, the principle of pneumatics using pressurized air to move objects was well understood by the mid-1800s. Demonstrations at scientific lectures showed how air could be used to push or pull small objects through sealed pipes. Often, the setup involved a little capsule inside a tube, propelled by a pump on either end. These demonstrations were novel, entertaining, and sometimes employed in banks or offices to send receipts or notes from one floor to another. But in 1854, the idea gained a champion, Josiah Latimer Clark, a young engineer working for the Electric Telegraph Company. Clark believed that air-powered tubes could do more than pass receipts. They could revolutionize urban communication. He envisioned an entire underground network of pneumatic tubes running beneath London, delivering letters, telegrams, and parcels across town in minutes. The capsules would be sealed containers, light and durable, capable of carrying up to 30 letters at a time. They would be placed into cylindrical iron tubes and propelled by air pressure, either positive pushing or negative suction, generated by stationary steam engines. Where the postman staggered across cobblestones, the pneumatic messenger would fly through the veins of the city. And unlike human messengers, it wouldn't get tired, it wouldn't gossip, it wouldn't stop for tea. The first pneumatic line. The dream took its first step toward reality in 1861, when the London Pneumatic Dispatch Company, LPDC, was formed. With funding from investors and political support from progress-minded officials, construction began on the first experimental line. It ran for about a third of a mile between the Eversholt Street sorting office near Euston Station and the Northwest District Post Office. The tube was made of cast iron, about 2 feet in diameter, buried 4 feet underground. Into it went cylindrical capsules containing bundles of mail, tightly packed and sealed. A stationary steam engine created vacuum pressure behind the capsule, sucking it along the tube at up to 30 miles per hour. At the receiving end, a gentle air cushion and a curved stop slowed it down before retrieval. By modern standards, it was simple. By 1860 standards, it was a marvel. The system worked, at least technically. Messages that once took 15 to 20 minutes to deliver by hand could now arrive in under a minute. The first successful public demonstration was met with applause. Dignitaries and engineers watched as a metal canister was sucked into the tube with a loud whoosh, then reappeared moments later at the other end, no worse for the journey. Newspapers described it in tones normally reserved for steamships or moon sightings. The age of airmail beneath the earth had begun. Expansion and ambition. Flush with early success, the LPDC made plans to expand. The next proposed route would link Holborn to the General Post Office near St. Martin's Le Grand, a stretch of nearly a mile. The idea was to eventually connect major postal hubs, including Paddington, Charing Cross, and even down to the Thames docks. Construction was arduous. Workers had to dig carefully to avoid existing pipes, sewers, and building foundations. Still, by 1865, the Holborn line was completed and operational. Tests continued to impress. One capsule reportedly traveled the full route in 60 seconds. Engineers even sent live guinea pigs and champagne bottles through the system to demonstrate how gentle it could be on fragile cargo. It wasn't just a novelty anymore. It was a working prototype of a new mode of transportation. At its peak, the company's system could carry up to 35 pounds of mail at once, delivering thousands of letters per hour. The Victorian dream of a subterranean message highway clean, fast, and immune to the chaos above was inching toward reality. And yet, even as the capsules whooshed beneath the city, cracks began to show in the vision. For all its speed, The pneumatic system was never quite as practical as its inventors hoped. Capsules could get stuck, especially if the tubes became warped. The system was expensive to maintain and vulnerable to moisture. Steam engines needed constant tending, and tube junctions were difficult to build. And crucially, it still required human workers to load and unload each capsule, meaning the labor savings were modest. But perhaps the biggest problem wasn't technical. It was scale. The pneumatic system worked wonderfully over short distances, but beyond a few miles, it became increasingly complex, costly, and vulnerable to disruption. Still, the dream did not die easily, because the promise was too seductive. A city where messages traveled on air, where the post moved faster than footsteps, where the world's busiest metropolis whispered to itself beneath its own feet. But how long could such a delicate system survive in a world that was already moving on to telegraph wires, telephones, and electrified everything? A postal ballet below the streets. By the late 1860s, the London Pneumatic Dispatch Company, LPDC, was moving more than just air, it was moving optimism. The expanding network connected post offices, sorting centers, and major railway stations. Capsules whooshed through the iron arteries beneath London's cobbled roads, carrying telegrams, letters, and printed matter. What had once taken 20 minutes on foot now arrived in under 2 minutes, carried by nothing but vacuum pressure and Victorian ingenuity. Mailboys became operators, tending to the intake and retrieval stations. Steam engines chugged in background buildings, hissing and thudding in rhythm with the pace of communication. Victorian officials marveled at the efficiency, the punctuality, and the sheer novelty. This was infrastructure as theater, and for a while, the audience was enthralled. But the story of the pneumatic dispatch system wasn't just one of underground pipes. It was also about how a city thinks and what it's willing to believe about its own future. The air beneath our feet. The pneumatic tubes weren't entirely hidden. Their existence was widely publicized, and people were fascinated by the idea that beneath their boots, letters were flying invisibly across town. This curiosity fed into a broader Victorian obsession. The technological sublime, the awe felt at inventions that bordered on the magical. Steam trains, telegraphs, photography, and now air-propelled mail. Newspapers carried breathless accounts. At last the postman may rest, for his duties have been assumed by the zephyrs beneath our feet. The Times, 1864. There were even public demonstrations. At the 1865 International Exhibition in London, a functioning pneumatic tube allowed visitors to send notes from one end of the exhibition hall to the other. Children begged to send their names through the system, and at least one cat reportedly made the journey unharmed if unamused. One journalist described the system as an invisible symphony of cylinders and suction, a ballet of correspondence performed in iron and steam. For a city obsessed with both efficiency and spectacle, this was ideal. The pneumatic system was fast, clean, hidden, but just strange enough to capture the imagination. And yet, imagination has limits, especially when weighed against money. The practical strain. Though the pneumatic dispatch was technologically impressive, it was economically fragile. Each new section of tubing cost thousands of pounds to build. Tunnels had to be dug carefully, often by hand, beneath the already tangled infrastructure of gas lines, sewers, and building foundations. Maintenance was constant. Moisture could cause the capsules to swell and jam. Dust and grit wore down the seals. The tubes sometimes warped due to heat or ground settling. Steam engines powering the vacuum pumps required full-time engineers to operate and maintain. Breakdowns weren't just inconvenient, they could bring entire sections of the network to a halt. A stuck capsule required laborers to unearth part of the pipe and extract it manually, a process that could take hours or days. The capsules themselves, though beautifully engineered, wore out quickly. They had to be replaced often, especially the rubber or leather seals that formed airtight rings. In the early years, the novelty outweighed the nuisance. But as the system grew, so did its complexity, and so did its competition. Telegraphs, trains, and the trouble with tubes. By the 1870s, telegraphs were already transforming how business and government communicated. A message that took 90 seconds by pneumatic tube could be sent by wire instantly with no moving parts, no capsules, and no risk of physical jamming. Then came telephone lines, still rare, but rising. The pneumatic system, once at the bleeding edge, began to seem quaint. It was a physical solution in a world increasingly run by invisible pulses. Moreover, the traditional postal system was adapting. Mail coaches, railway sorting cars, and eventually bicycles allowed human carriers to move faster and more efficiently. Urban reforms improved roadways, making surface transport more reliable. The need for a private underground network of air-powered mail delivery simply diminished. And with it, so did funding. The LPDC, once buoyed by public fascination and political support, struggled to remain viable. Investors began to pull out. Government interest cooled. The post office, while appreciative of the system's speed, found it increasingly difficult to justify the costs. Expansion plans were shelved. Maintenance was reduced. And the whooshing capsules, once symbols of the future, became the clunking ghosts of yesterday's innovation. The final delivery. By the 1880s, the system was only sporadically used. Officially, it was shut down, but in practice its tubes sat mostly idle. Some remained buried and forgotten. Others were quietly dug up during road repairs. The stations were repurposed or abandoned. The capsules vanished into storage, sold as curios or scrapped. The age of pneumatic dispatch was over. In 1874, one engineer with the LPDC wrote, mournfully, "We built a system of air and hope. It worked, oh, how it worked, but the world moved on while we remained beneath it. It had been a marvel, a working marvel, and it had still failed. But not because it didn't do what it promised. It failed because the world changed faster than the system could evolve." That is often the fate of forgotten technologies, not dramatic failure, but slow obsolescence. They do their job until a better, cheaper, or simpler idea comes along. The tubes that echo still. The idea of using air to move messages would never fully disappear. Decades later, department stores, banks, and factories around the world would adopt smaller pneumatic tube systems to send cash or receipts internally. In fact, some systems still operate today, especially in hospitals, where sealed tubes carry lab samples between wings. But the Victorian vision of an entire city stitched together by underground pipes, whispering messages at 30 miles per hour, was never replicated at scale. Still, the legacy remains. Every time we marvel at seamless communication, every time a message arrives instantly, invisibly, through fiber optics or cellular towers, we are echoing the dream of the London pneumatic dispatch. A dream where distance disappears, not by magic, but by mechanism. The fatting sound of whoosh. By the 1890s, the great Victorian fantasy of pneumatic message tubes had largely disappeared from the public eye. The London Pneumatic Dispatch Company quietly dissolved, and the system, once celebrated in newsprint and exhibitions, became little more than an engineering footnote. In its place rose quieter, faster, and more invisible systems. The telegraph, humming across poles and wires. The telephone, slowly connecting homes and offices by voice. The postal service, modernizing with bicycles, better roads, and efficient sorting methods. Even as other cities like New York and Paris toyed with their own versions of pneumatic tubes, none embraced it with quite the same theatrical ambition as London had. None built a true underground web of breath and brass. In a way, the pneumatic dispatch system was a casualty of its own ambition. It worked too well to be dismissed, but not well enough to survive a changing world. Still, it lingered in unexpected places. Echoes in steel and silence. In department stores and banks throughout the early 20th century, small-scale pneumatic tube systems became commonplace. They weren't networks. They were loops, tools of internal efficiency, not city-wide marvels. A customer handed over payment. A clerk sealed the cash and receipt into a tube. A hiss, a click, and the capsule vanished only to reappear minutes later with change and stamped papers. These were the humble descendants of the London dream, no longer cast in grand terms, no longer trying to reform urban life. They simply moved objects from point A to point B quietly, reliably. Even today, hospitals use similar systems to send lab samples between wings or to move paperwork through sterile corridors. Airports, mailrooms, and some industrial facilities have retained or reinvented these systems for their speed and low labor cost. But they're invisible to the average person now, tucked behind walls, hidden in ceilings, sealed off from public imagination. What began as a Victorian dream of speed and control had become, ironically, mundane. And yet, for those who remember or choose to look, at still whispers. What the Victorians taught us. The rise and fall of the London pneumatic dispatch system wasn't just a story of technology. It was a story about belief. The Victorians believed deeply in progress, but also in visibility. The marvel of the pneumatic system wasn't just its function. It was the idea that something as ephemeral as air could be harnessed to move objects, that a city could be replumbed not for water or sewage, but for information. In an age where communication moved at the speed of horse or human, the notion of a sealed capsule arriving in seconds felt like magic. And for a time, it was real. They were trying to conquer urban friction, the slowness, the traffic, the messiness of people and places. Pneumatics promised a cleaner kind of connection, one untouched by weather, labor, or delay. But like all magic tricks, once the mechanics are revealed, and once the audience becomes used to the outcome, the wonder fades. And so the tubes were forgotten. Or were they? Because the desire behind them never left. From iron tubes to fiber optics. If you follow the arc of communication from the pneumatic dispatch system forward, you find a surprisingly straight line. Tubes moved letters. Telegraphs moved words. Telephones moved voices. Satellites moved images. The internet now moves everything. The difference is speed, scope, and scale. But the core goal is the same: to eliminate distance. The Victorians tried to do it with pipes and pumps. We now do it with code and cables. But both efforts reflect the same human need: to compress time, to minimize waiting, to shrink the world. And so, even though no one stands over an iron hatch waiting for a letter to arrive with a gust of air anymore, we still expect instant delivery, just through different tubes. Today's pneumatic dispatch is Wi-Fi, broadband, Bluetooth. Unseen, faster than air, but built on the same dream. The underground that wasn't forgotten. In recent years, a few of the original pneumatic tubes beneath London have been unearthed during infrastructure projects. They are rusty, warped, sometimes filled with rainwater, but still recognizable. Urban explorers have photographed abandoned intake chambers, complete with faded control panels and rusted capsule bins. Museums have restored a few capsules sleek, bullet-shaped canisters no longer racing beneath the city, but sitting quietly behind glass. And in the minds of historians, engineers, and romantics, the system still stirs something. Because it wasn't a failure. It was a prototype, a rehearsal for what would come later. A moment in history when the air beneath your feet carried messages faster than you could walk. A time when a letter, A loaf of bread or a live guinea pig might vanish into the ground and reappear blocks away, like magic. It reminds us that the future often begins in forgotten tunnels, with experiments that seem too strange to last. Until one day they do. And the city changes forever.